13 meters straight down, in the black, wet throat of a cave in northern Spain, there's a pile of bones nobody can fully explain. At the bottom of it sits a skull. Near the front of that skull, just above where the eyebrows would have been, there are two dents punched clean through the bone. Not one, two, in almost the exact same spot. A forensic pathologist looked at those two dents the way she would look at a modern crime scene. Same location, same angle, delivered, most likely, by the same object, swung twice by someone standing over a body that was already down. That is not an accident. That is not a fall. That is a decision made in a fraction of a second, roughly 400,000 years ago. The place is called Cima de los Huesos. Translated plainly, it means the pit of bones. It sits deep inside the Atapuerca Mountains, reached today by ladders, ropes, and a crawl through passages barely wide enough for a set of shoulders. In 1997, a team led by paleontologist one Luis Arzuaga climbed down into that shaft and found something they were not prepared for. Not one skeleton, not two, the remains of at least 28 individuals, tangled together at the bottom of a hole that nothing could simply wander into. 28 people, men, women, children, all belonging to a species called Homo heidelbergensis, a slow-moving ancestor shared by us and by the Neanderthals who would come later. That is not a family. That is closer to an entire small community gone and stacked at the bottom of a natural well. Here is the part that keeps archaeologists up at night. There is no river that could have washed these bodies down there. No predator drags its kills through a vertical shaft and leaves the skeletons intact. Something or someone put them there on purpose. For decades, the leading theory was almost tender, that this shaft was the world's oldest known act of care for the dead, a chosen resting place, chosen by people who did not want to simply leave their dead out in the open for scavengers to find. Then somebody actually looked closely at skull number 17, and the tender theory got a lot more complicated. Whoever left that body down there did not just place a corpse gently in a hole. Somebody killed a person twice in the same spot on the head, and only then did the body end up 13 meters below the surface of the earth. Among the bones, the team found one more thing that refuses to sit quietly. A hand axe carved from pink quartzite, a stone that does not occur naturally anywhere near that cave. Someone carried it in from somewhere else, shaped it with real skill, and left it among the dead. The excavators nicknamed it Excalibur. So picture the scene those bones are actually describing. A community capable of grief, capable of ritual, capable of carrying a beautiful object down into darkness as an offering. And also, in at least one case, capable of caving in the front of another person's skull and letting the body fall where it fell. Both of those things are true at the same time, in the same small population, roughly twice as far back in time as anything you would call recognizably human civilization. That is the uncomfortable part. We, like our ancestors, simple. The evidence keeps refusing to cooperate. The shaft itself was not found by scientists. In the 1890s, a mining company cut a railway trench straight through the Atapuerca Hills to reach nearby coal deposits, and in doing so, sliced open a hidden network of caves that had sat sealed for hundreds of thousands of years. Nobody realized what was inside them for decades. Serious excavation did not begin until 1976, led by paleontologist Emiliano Aguirre, and it was not until 1984 that a young researcher named one Luis Arzuaga started the long, grinding project of actually reaching the pit of bones itself, a project that would consume the next 4 decades of his career. Every bucket of sediment pulled from that shaft was carried out by hand and sieved, grain by grain, for fragments smaller than a fingernail. That is not an exaggeration for effect. That is simply what it takes to recover thousands of bone fragments from space that narrow, that deep, and that difficult to reach. The demographic profile of the pit only deepens the mystery. Most of the 28 individuals were adolescents or young adults. Very few infants, very few elderly. That is not what a natural disaster looks like. A flood or a rockfall would have taken the old and the very young along with everyone else. It looks selective in a way nobody can fully explain. In 2015, researcher Nohemi Sala and her colleagues ran the two skull injuries through CT scanning and detailed fracture analysis, the same tools a modern medical examiner would use on a contemporary case. Their conclusion, published plainly in a scientific journal, stated that accidental injury or a fall could not reasonably account for both wounds landing in almost the same location. That kind of precision rules out a great deal. It rules out a rock falling from the cave roof. It rules out a stumble in the dark. What remains, uncomfortably, is intent, a blow delivered by another person, aimed and repeated. Not every researcher agrees on what happened next, and that disagreement is worth respecting rather than smoothing over. Some argue the body was deliberately placed in the shaft afterward by others in the group, a strange, early form of dealing with a death that could not simply be ignored. Others remain cautious, noting that a single skull, however striking, is thin evidence for an entire theory of motive. What nobody seriously disputes anymore is the basic shape of the find. A community capable of complex behavior around its own dead, whatever that behavior actually meant, at a depth in time when most popular imagination still pictures nothing more than grunting and gravel. The Atapuerca complex holds an even older secret in a nearby chamber called Cima del Elefante, where researchers identified hominin remains and simple tools dated to roughly 1.2 million years ago, among the earliest confirmed evidence of humans anywhere in Western Europe. This one small range of Spanish hills has quietly kept score of nearly the entire human story. Among the 28 skeletons pulled from the pit of bones is one so complete it stunned the team that found it, a skull researchers nicknamed Migalon. Officially cataloged as Cranium 5, its face, jaw, and brain case preserved almost entirely intact after 400,000 years underground. It remains one of the best preserved skulls from this entire era found anywhere on the planet. The conditions inside that shaft, cold, wet, sealed away from oxygen and scavengers alike, did something else nobody expected. In 2013, a team led by geneticist Matthias Meyer at the Max Planck Institute managed to extract and sequence fragments of DNA directly from these bones, at the time the oldest human genetic material ever successfully recovered anywhere in the world. The result only deepened the mystery instead of resolving it. Based on skeletal features, everyone expected this population's DNA to link most closely to Neanderthals, their most obvious descendants. Instead, the mitochondrial DNA pointed toward a much stranger, more distant relative, the Denisovans, a population otherwise known only from a cold cave thousands of miles away in Siberia. That single result rewrote parts of the human family tree overnight, and it is a thread this documentary will pick back up much later when the Denisovans return in a very different and very personal story of their own. Visitors who make the climb down into the pit today describe the same details again and again. The narrow squeeze partway through where a grown adult has to exhale to fit. The sudden drop in temperature. The specific mineral smell of wet limestone that has not seen open air in longer than any human civilization has existed. Every single bone fragment recovered from that shaft has passed through the hands of a graduate student or researcher hunched over a laboratory table for hours, turning a piece smaller than a coin under magnification, checking it against a reference collection before it earns even a single line in a published paper. That patience is the actual engine behind everything this documentary is about to claim. Not a guess, not a hunch dressed up as fact. Thousands of hours of exactly this kind of unglamorous, repetitive checking, performed by people who will mostly never see their own name attached to the headline the discovery eventually generates. It is worth remembering, before this film goes any further, that every chapter still ahead rests on exactly this kind of labor. Someone somewhere, spent a career kneeling in wet dirt or hunched over a lab bench, so that a single sentence about an ordinary day 2 million years ago could be spoken with any real confidence at all. The final tally from that single shaft now stands at more than 6,500 bone fragments, representing at least 28 individuals, making it the largest known collection of ancient human remains from anywhere in the world this old. An entire vanished community reassembled one labeled bag at a time. 6,500 fragments is not a number that arrives quickly. It arrives across 4 decades of summers, of researchers returning year after year to the same cold shaft, adding one more crate to a growing collection that eventually became large enough to answer questions nobody even knew how to ask when the project first began. Excavation at Cima de los Huesos is, remarkably, still ongoing today, the same narrow shaft still being worked by researchers every single summer, which means this particular mystery has not actually finished being written. Somewhere in that mud, right now, there may be one more fragment waiting to change the story yet again. The human bones were not alone down there, either. Cave bear remains turned up mixed in with the 28 individuals, a detail that briefly complicated the entire picture, until careful analysis showed the bears had very likely fallen or wandered into the shaft on their own, an entirely separate tragedy layered accidentally on top of a human one. Dating the site precisely required its own patient detective work, using a mineral layer called flowstone, calcite that slowly forms over centuries as water drips through limestone, sealing whatever lies beneath it in place like a lid closing on a box that nobody can open early. We're taught to imagine early humans as a kind of montage, grunting, dragging clubs, filling in time between meals with nothing much at all, but a species that mourns its dead with a hand-carved gift and also commits what looks disturbingly like a personal, targeted killing is not filling time. It is living a life, a full one. So here's the actual question this whole documentary is built around, and it is not the question people usually ask. Not what tools did they use, or when did they discover fire. The question is simpler and somehow harder. What did a person in that world actually do, hour by hour, from the moment they opened their eyes to the moment they closed them again? Because for almost 2 million years, that is all there was. No calendars, no cities, no written record of a single ordinary Tuesday. Just day after day after day, stacking up into a silence so total that even a murder from 400,000 years ago genuinely counts, as one of the most detailed personal stories we have from that entire span of time. Stand in that cave today if you can stomach the climb, and the walls still weep groundwater the way they did then. It is cold in a way that gets into the joints. It is exactly the kind of place a person only enters on purpose, carrying something or someone they meant to leave behind. And somewhere at the bottom of that climb is a skull with 2 matching dents above where the eyebrows used to be from a blow, and then a second blow delivered by a person who had every reason to stop after the first one and did not. If that is the oldest personal deliberate death we have ever managed to find written in a bone, then the version of early humans you were handed as a child, the grunting simpleton with a club, was never going to survive contact with the actual evidence. Somebody sold you that story. It is time to find out why. In 1908, in a small French village called La Chapelle aux Saints, 3 brothers digging in a cave found a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton. It is still one of the best preserved Neanderthal finds on record. It is also the reason you picture cavemen the way you do, and that is a genuine problem. A French paleontologist named Marcelin Boule got hold of those bones in 1911 and rebuilt the man from scratch. In his reconstruction, the spine curved forward. The knees stayed bent. The head hung low on a thick, slouching neck, like something that had never once stood fully upright in its life. That single drawing became the template. Every hunched, knuckle-dragging caveman cartoon, every grunting brute in a museum window, every punchline about evolution traces its posture back to one man's interpretation of one skeleton, sketched more than a century ago. Here is what Bull did not know, or chose not to mention. The man he was reconstructing was old by the standards of his time, and his body showed it. Severe arthritis in the spine and hips, missing teeth, joint disease that would bend anyone forward in any era, on any continent, alive today or half a lifetime ago. In 1957, tooth anatomists named William Strauss and Alexander Cave went back through the same bones with modern medical knowledge, and the verdict was blunt. This individual could stand as straight as any of us. What Bull had drawn was not a species. It was one sick, elderly patient mistaken for an entire kind of person. By then it did not matter. The hunched brute was already on posters in textbooks, inside the heads of millions of school children who would grow up, have children of their own, and pass the same wrong picture down again, generation after generation, without a single one of them ever questioning it. In 2019, anatomist Martin Heisler and a team at the University of Zurich ran the same skeleton through modern medical imaging one more time, out of pure thoroughness. The results matched what Strauss and Cave had already found decades earlier. Severe joint degeneration, a jaw that had lost most of its teeth long before death, a spine consistent with an aging body, not with a different kind of creature entirely. The image had a long cultural afterlife regardless. It shaped World's Fair exhibits in the early 20th century, comic strips like Alley-Oop, and eventually decades of Hollywood cavemen shuffling across movie screens with clubs over their shoulders. Each new version borrowing its posture from a sick old man nobody had bothered to properly diagnose. It is worth naming plainly what this myth was doing culturally, not just scientifically. In the same decades that Bull was sketching his hunched Neanderthal, several prominent European scientists were busy constructing rigid ladders of human progress, with certain living populations placed conveniently near the bottom, just above the brutes, and their own populations placed conveniently at the top. A stupid, violent caveman at the base of that ladder was not just a scientific error sitting quietly in a museum basement. It was a useful prop, reused again and again to make a particular self-flattering story about civilization and progress feel like settled, objective fact instead of the flattering guesswork it actually was. None of this is ancient history in the way it might feel. Plenty of adults walking around today can still picture, without effort, that exact stooped silhouette from a childhood textbook. Decades after the science underneath, it was already thoroughly debunked in academic journals nobody outside the field ever reads. That gap between what specialists have known for over 60 years and what most of the public still pictures without thinking twice is exactly the gap this documentary is built to close, one uncomfortable piece of actual evidence at a time. The myth kept mutating to fit whatever a given decade needed it to mean. Mid-century cartoons used the hunched brute mostly for comedy, a lovable idiot with a club. Later decades leaned on the same silhouette to make lazy, sweeping claims about supposedly natural, unavoidable male aggression, treating one bad Victorian sketch as if it were a permanent biological verdict on an entire species. Even a company selling car insurance in the early 2000s built an entire advertising campaign around an offended, articulate caveman objecting to exactly this stereotype, a strange, unintentional piece of pop culture evidence for just how deeply embedded and how ripe for satire that hunched image had become. The discovery of Lucy, a remarkably complete Australopithecus afarensis skeleton found in Ethiopia in 1974, briefly shifted public fascination toward a smaller, more delicate-looking ancestor, walking upright on two legs at a height barely over a meter. Even that shift, though, rarely changed the default posture handed to anyone imagined a little further along the timeline. Archaeology itself eventually turned a hard, self-critical eye on exactly this kind of storytelling. Starting in the 1960s, a movement researchers call processual archaeology, led in large part by Louis Binford, insisted that claims about ancient behavior be tested against measurable physical evidence rather than simply asserted based on a compelling-looking reconstruction. That shift is the entire reason a documentary like this one can even attempt what it is attempting, building its picture of an ordinary early human day out of cut marks, isotopes, and fracture patterns instead of out of a single artist's imagination from 100 years ago. It is a slower, less flattering way to tell a story. It does not offer one clean drawing you can print in a textbook and never question again. What it offers instead, chapter by chapter, is something closer to the truth, assembled honestly out of whatever the ground actually agreed to give back. There is something almost funny about how long the correction has taken. 60 years of solid evidence, and a bent spine drawn by one Frenchman in 1911 is still, right now, probably the first image that flashed through your own head the moment this documentary started. That staying power is worth respecting rather than mocking. A vivid, simple image will always travel faster than a careful, qualified one. It takes one paragraph to draw a hunched brute. It took an entire chapter just to walk back that single wrong picture, piece by piece, and this documentary still has 18 more chapters left to go. It helps to remember that Bull himself was not acting in bad faith. He was working with the tools, the assumptions, and the biases of his own time, genuinely convinced he was reading the evidence correctly. That is precisely what makes the myth so durable. It was not built by a villain. It was built by an ordinary, confident expert, making an ordinary, understandable mistake. Every field carries a few of these quiet, foundational errors, confidently stated, rarely revisited, quietly shaping everything built on top of them for decades afterward. Recognizing one and correcting it out loud is not an attack on science. It is exactly what good science is supposed to keep doing to itself forever. Corrected or not, the myth still did real damage while it stood. An entire century of assuming the worst about the earliest humans meant an entire century of overlooking or simply not thinking to look for exactly the kind of evidence this documentary now leans on constantly: care, skill, symbolism, community. It is genuinely strange to consider how much easier this documentary would have been to make a century ago, and how much shallower it would have been for it. Confirmation is comforting. It rarely teaches anyone anything they did not already believe going in. The harder path, the one this film is choosing, means sitting with contradiction instead of resolving it too quickly. A species capable of the Cima de los Huesos pit, murder and mourning tangled together in one small population, was never going to fit neatly onto either side of a simple hero or villain story. Keep that asymmetry in mind for everything still ahead. Every uncomfortable, complicated truth this film uncovers from here forward will always be easier to forget than the simple, wrong version was to remember. That is not a flaw in the evidence. It is simply the cost of choosing accuracy over a good, clean story. It is worth asking why that image spread so easily and clung on so hard. And the honest answer is uncomfortable. A stupid, brutish ancestor fit perfectly into a story that scientists and empires of that era already wanted to tell about themselves. A tidy climb from ape to brute to civilized man, standing at the very top. That same ladder got put to uglier uses too, propping up ideas about which living human populations counted as more evolved than others. The brutish caveman was never just bad science. For a while, he was a convenient tool, and convenient tools tend to stay in circulation long after they should have been thrown out. Even the word caveman deserves a second look. Most early humans did not spend their lives underground. Caves simply happened to protect bones and tools from weather, scavengers, and time far better than open ground does. We are not looking at where people lived. We're looking at the handful of places where evidence of them managed to survive at all. That single fact quietly warps everything. Stone tools survive. Bone survives sometimes. Baskets do not. Wooden spears mostly do not. Rope, skin bags, string, the actual texture of daily labor, almost none of it lasts 200,000 years. What we call the archaeological record is really just whatever refused to rot. So when you picture a caveman standing around with a club, doing nothing, You are actually looking at the shadow of an idea from 1911, filtered through decades of eugenics-era anthropology, and thinned out even further by the simple fact that most of what people actually did all day has rotted away and left no trace at all. None of that means we know nothing. It means we have to work harder for what we do know, the way a detective works a cold case instead of reading a confession. Forensic were patterns on teeth, isotopes locked in a bone, cut marks under a microscope, burn patterns in ancient hearths. It is slower. It is also finally honest. And what that slower, honest method actually turns up is stranger than the myth ever was. Not a grunting brute killing time between meals. A species making decisions all day, every day, for nearly 2 million years, most of which never once got written down, because writing itself was still a couple million mornings away. So set the club down. Forget the hunch in the spine. What we are actually chasing across the rest of this film is a full day in a life nobody ever thought to write about, reconstructed piece by piece, out of stone, bone, ash, and the occasional skull with a story it was never supposed to tell. Somewhere in what is now Ethiopia, roughly 2.6 million years ago, a member of the genus Homo picked up a rock, struck it against another rock at a very specific angle, and knocked off a sharp flake of stone. That flake is the oldest object we can point to and say, with real confidence, a person made this on purpose. It does not look like much. A rounded core, a few sharp flakes struck off one side. Archaeologists call this the Oldowan toolkit, and for a very long stretch of time, it was the entire technological output of our lineage. Not a bad start, exactly. Just a very, very long one. Here is a trick that makes the scale of this almost bearable to think about. Take the entire span of a human story from that first struck flake to right now and compress it into a single 24-hour clock. Midnight to midnight. One full day, standing in for 2.6 million years. On that clock, stone tools like the one from Ethiopia appear right at midnight, hour zero. Homo erectus, taller, longer-legged, the first of our ancestors to walk out of Africa, does not show up until well past 4 in the morning. Fire, used and controlled, does not reliably appear until sometime after 9 at night. Agriculture, the first farms, the first fields of wheat and barley someone actually planted on purpose, does not arrive until 11:56 in the evening. 4 minutes before midnight. Writing shows up with about 90 seconds left on the clock. Everything you would call recorded history fits inside the very last minute of that entire day. Which means if you're looking for the people who filled the other 23 hours and 56 minutes, you are not looking for a footnote. You're looking for the main event. Almost the entire runtime of the human story happened before a single word of it was ever written down. That is not a gap in the record. That is the record. 95% of everything a human being has ever done, thought, built, feared, or loved happened during those hours, and almost none of it comes with a name attached, a date, or a single surviving sentence describing how it felt. The species responsible for that first struck flake was likely Homo habilis, a name the paleontologist Louis Leakey gave them in the early 1960s. It means roughly handyman, small-brained by later standards, small body too, and yet already doing something no other animal on the planet was doing with any consistency. Making a usable stone flake is not luck. You have to choose the right kind of rock, one that fractures in a predictable, glass-like way. You have to strike it at close to the correct angle, with close to the correct force, and you have to do it again the next time you need a blade, and the time after that for the rest of your life. In 2015, researchers at a site called Lomekwi, also in Kenya, found stone tools dated to roughly 3.3 million years ago, older than the genus Homo itself. Whoever made those was not us, not yet. Something even earlier had already started down this same road, long before anything we would recognize as a person. Here is another way to feel the scale, one that does not rely on a clock. Divide 2.6 million years by an average human generation of roughly 25 years, and you get somewhere near 104,000 generations of people between that first struck flake and the generation currently reading these words. For comparison, only about 500 of those generations separate us from the first farms. Only around 12 separate us from the founding of the United States. 104,000 against 12. That is the actual size of the silence this documentary is trying to speak into. At a site called Kangera South, also in Kenya, researcher Thomas Plummer and his team found something that complicates the picture of these early toolmakers even further. The stone used for some tools had clearly been carried from sources more than 10 kilometers away, meaning someone had scouted good material in advance and planned a return trip specifically to use it. That is not the behavior of a creature simply reacting to whatever rock happened to be lying nearby. That is forward planning carried out by a brain roughly 1/3 the size of yours, at a site well over 2 million years old. Brain size itself crept upward slowly across this same stretch. Homo habilis carried a brain of roughly 600 to 700 cubic centimeters. By the time Homo erectus was walking the same landscapes, that figure had climbed toward 900, and it kept climbing for a very long time after that, in step with an increasingly sophisticated relationship to stone, fire, and each other. What is genuinely strange, viewed from the outside, is how little the tools themselves changed for such an enormous stretch of that time. The basic Oldowan chopper and flake stayed in use, largely unaltered, for close to 1 million years, an almost unimaginable span of technological stability by the standards of a species that now redesigns its phones every 12 months. That stability probably says less about a lack of imagination and more about how knowledge actually traveled back then. No blueprints, no manuals, just one person showing another, by hand, in person, exactly how it was done, generation folding into generation with only small, hard-won improvements slipping through here and there. It also helps to abandon the idea of a single tidy ladder climbing steadily from ape to modern human. For most of the span covered by this clock, multiple different hominin species overlapped in time and often in the same landscape. Robust, heavy-jawed Paranthropus branches chewing tough vegetation alongside the leaner, tool-making Homo lineage, neither one a direct stepping stone to the other. A discovery announced in 2015 pushed this bushy, tangled picture even further. In a South African cave system called Rising Star, researcher Lee Berger and his team recovered the remains of a previously unknown species, Homo naledi, small-brained, in some ways strikingly primitive-looking, yet dated to somewhere between 236,000 and 335,000 years ago, existing at the very same time as early Homo sapiens. A brain roughly 1/3 the size of a modern human, reached only through a passage so narrow that the excavation team specifically recruited slender researchers small enough to fit through it, and yet some members of Berger's team argue the remains were deliberately placed deep in that difficult chamber, a possible echo of the same puzzle already raised by the Pit of Bones in Spain. Whatever the final answer on that specific claim turns out to be, the larger lesson holds regardless. Small brains and complex behavior were never as neatly separated as the old evolutionary ladder liked to pretend. This was always a crowded, overlapping bush of different human-like species, not a single file line marching steadily toward us. None of these dates come from guesswork. Researchers rely on techniques like potassium-argon dating, which measures the slow, steady decay of radioactive elements trapped in volcanic rock layers, and uranium series dating, used on cave minerals like the flowstone that often seals a fossil deposit in place, locking a minimum age onto whatever lies beneath it. It is worth being honest about the size of the silence surrounding even these dated moments. For almost every single hour on that 24-hour clock, in almost every single place on the planet, absolutely nothing survived to tell us anything at all. The sites named across this documentary are not the whole story. They are the rare, lucky exceptions where the ground, against enormous odds, happened to keep its receipts. Think of it this way. If every surviving fossil and stone tool from this entire span were laid end to end, they would still cover only a tiny fraction of the actual ground once walked by actual people, actual children, actual arguments, actual laughter, none of which left behind so much as a whisper for us to recover. That absence is not a defeat for this documentary. It is the entire reason it exists. Every chapter from here forward is an attempt to squeeze a genuine, specific day out of that overwhelming silence, using exactly the kind of stubborn, patient evidence introduced in this chapter and the one before it. So carry the clock forward with you. Midnight is behind us now. The first flake already struck. Ahead lies nearly a full day's worth of ordinary mornings, ordinary hungers, and ordinary fears, waiting for someone to finally take them seriously enough to ask what they actually felt like from the inside. There's a strange comfort hiding inside a scale this large, if you let yourself feel it. Every anxiety, every rivalry, every small triumph that ever felt enormous to the person living through it has already happened an almost uncountable number of times before, to people whose names and faces are gone completely, leaving only the pattern behind. That pattern is what this documentary is actually chasing, chapter after chapter, not a list of dates and species names, but the shape of a life lived inside a body very much like yours, making decisions with information that was always incomplete in a world that never once asked permission before changing the terms. So forget the clock for a moment and the generations and the species names. Picture instead a single set of eyes opening at first light, somewhere on that impossibly long timeline, with absolutely no idea it was being watched, across an unimaginable gulf of time, by someone who would eventually come looking for the story of exactly this one ordinary morning. Every single date in this chapter came from a laboratory, not a guess, cross-checked across multiple independent dating techniques, argued over in journals, revised when new evidence demanded it. That rigor is not decoration. It is the entire reason any of these numbers deserve your trust in the first place. With the scale of the story finally in view, this documentary can stop talking about millennia in the abstract and start talking about mornings, specific, physical, uncomfortable mornings, beginning with the single most dangerous hour any of these people ever had to survive, the hour right after opening their eyes. Which means tool-making is not the finish line of becoming human. It is closer to the starting gun, fired earlier than we expected, by creatures we still argue about how to even classify. So hold that clock in your head as we move forward. Almost every chapter left in this documentary takes place somewhere in that same enormous, quiet stretch of hours, long before midnight, long before farms, long before anyone thought to write a single word down for someone else to read 100,000 years later. The question we are actually chasing has nothing to do with tool typologies or species names. Not really. It is smaller than that, and somehow much bigger. For nearly 2 million years, across thousands of generations, what did an ordinary day inside that stretch of time actually feel like, from the first breath in the morning to the last one before sleep? No alarm clock, no sunrise gently filtering through curtains, just the sudden, total alertness of an animal that survived one more night and needs to confirm immediately whether it is still safe before it does anything else at all. Early hominins almost certainly slept the way chimpanzees and gorillas still do today, up off the ground, in nests built fresh each night from bent branches and leaves, high enough in a tree that most ground predators could not easily follow. Sleeping on open ground was not cozy. It was close to a death wish. Waking up then was not a soft process. It was a scan. Eyes open, body still, ears doing most of the actual work, listening for the specific rustle that means something with teeth is closer than it should be. We know exactly how real that threat was, because we have found the evidence written directly onto a skull. In 1924, in a lime quarry in South Africa, a fossil known as the Tong Child was pulled out of the rock, a skull belonging to a young Australopithecus africanus, who died roughly 2.5 million years ago. For decades, nobody could explain the strange puncture marks around the eye sockets. Then, in 2006, researcher Lee Berger matched those marks to the talons of a large eagle. The same pattern still visible today on monkey skulls found beneath the nests of African crowned eagles that hunt exactly this way. A child, snatched from above, carried off, eaten. That is not a metaphor for how dangerous the world was. That is a direct, physical record of it, preserved in bone for 2.5 million years until someone finally learned to read it. The sky was not the only direction danger came from. At a site called Swartkrans in South Africa, researcher Bob Brain examined Australopithecus skulls bearing two small, round punctures spaced exactly the width of a leopard's lower canines. Brain concluded that big cats had been dragging hominins into trees to feed, casually, the way leopards still do with monkey carcasses today. So the morning scan was not paranoia. It was a statistically reasonable habit built by a lineage that had, quite literally, been eaten from above and dragged into trees by things below, often enough that the fear earned a permanent place in the nervous system. Sleep researcher Jerome Siegel studied several present-day hunter-gatherer groups, including the Hadza of Tanzania, and found something that quietly overturns a popular modern assumption. These groups did not sleep in two separate segmented blocks through the night. They mostly slept in one continuous stretch, waking largely with the drop in temperature before dawn rather than any fixed internal alarm. Which means the cold itself, not a sunrise, not a rooster, not a bell, was very often the actual signal that ended the night. A body waking up shivering in the gray hour before real light, already halfway into the vigilance the rest of the day was about to demand of it. Beyond direct danger, early hominins almost certainly learned to eavesdrop on the alarm calls of other species entirely, the sudden silence of birds, the sharp bark of a nearby monkey troop, borrowing threat information from an entire ecosystem of animals that had their own excellent reasons to be afraid at that exact moment. Only once that first scan came back clear, no silence where there should be birdsong, no shape where there should be empty grass, did the second calculation even have room to start. Which direction yesterday's foraging had come up thin, which direction the wind was blowing scent toward or away from, and how much daylight stood between now and the next safe scan at dusk. Even the moon mattered. Researcher Kenneth Van Orsdal, studying lion hunting behavior in Uganda, found that big cats succeed far more often on dark, moonless nights when prey struggles to see them coming. A hominin group camped without fire on the wrong night of the lunar cycle was gambling with genuinely worse odds than it might have realized. Thirst added its own constant, quieter pressure on top of hunger and fear. A reliable water source might be a fixed feature of a group's range, or it might dry up entirely with the season, forcing a calculation every single morning about how far to travel and how much risk to accept, simply to keep everyone's mouth from going dry by midday. Carrying an infant added an entirely separate layer of vulnerability. A mother scanning for predators, judging wind direction, and planning the day's route was very often doing all of it while physically holding a child too young to walk, or too young to keep pace, its own survival depending entirely on her staying sharp every single moment. Archaeologist Timothy Taylor has argued that some kind of simple sling or wrap, made from hide or woven plant fiber, was likely an early and essential piece of technology precisely because it freed a mother's hands and arms for exactly this kind of dual-tasked vigilance, even though the material itself would have rotted away and left no trace for us to ever directly find. That absence is worth sitting with for a moment. An object this important to daily survival, quite possibly used every single day for a large portion of a person's life, may have vanished from the archaeological record so completely that we are left guessing at its existence purely from logic, rather than ever actually holding one in our hands. So the first hour of the day was never one single decision. It was dozens of small, overlapping ones: threat, wind, moonlight memory, thirst, a child's weight against a hip, stacked on top of each other before the sun had even fully cleared the horizon. None of it looked dramatic from the outside. No music swelling, no danger actually visible most mornings. Just a body standing still for a few extra seconds, senses stretched as wide as they could go, before committing to a single step in any direction at all. Multiply that few extra seconds of stillness across every single morning of every single life, across thousands of generations, and you start to understand something. This was not a species relaxing into existence. This was a species that woke up braced every single day for nearly 2 million years running, before anyone thought to call any of it ordinary. And once that stillness finally broke, once the scan came back clear enough to move, the actual work of the day could begin in earnest. Work that increasingly depended on an object small enough to carry, sharp enough to matter, and hard enough to argue that these mornings were never as empty-handed as they looked. It is easy, from a warm room, to treat all of this as background trivia, interesting facts about a distant, unrelatable past. It stops feeling distant the moment you notice your own pulse jump at a sudden noise in an otherwise empty house. The exact same ancient circuitry firing for the exact same ancient reason, just with the volume turned down. That circuitry did not get gentler over 2 million years. It simply stopped having quite as much to actually do most days, left running in the background of lives that, for the overwhelming majority of people reading this right now, will never once involve an actual predator wading in actual tall grass. It is strange to think that the single most dangerous part of an early hominin's entire day was simply existing in the first hour after waking, before a single decision had even been made. Everything covered in the rest of this film, the tools, the hunts, the fire, the language, was built on top of a body that first had to survive its own alarm clock. Fear this constant does not stay purely defensive for very long, either. A mind spending that much energy anticipating danger is also necessarily a mind constantly modeling the future, running scenarios, weighing outcomes, quietly building exactly the kind of forward-looking intelligence this documentary keeps finding evidence of in the stone tools that same body was about to pick up. So when an early hominin opened its eyes each morning, that was the baseline. Not boredom, not idle time to fill. A running, background calculation, half-conscious, constantly updated. Who is near me? What direction is the wind coming from? And is anything up there watching me right now? And underneath that fear sat a second, equally urgent problem, one that never let up either. Hunger. A body that size, that active, burns through stored energy fast, and there was no pantry, no leftovers in a container, nothing waiting from the night before. Whatever you ate today, you had to find today. Modern estimates put the daily energy needs of an active early hominin well above 2,000 calories, all of it earned through movement, all of it uncertain until the moment food was actually in hand. Waking up hungry was not an unfortunate start to the day. It was the entire engine driving everything that came next. Predator and prey in the same body, in the same first few minutes of consciousness. Watch the tree lean for whatever might be watching you, then immediately go looking for something smaller and slower to eat before the sun gets too high and the heat becomes its own kind of enemy. There was no version of this life where you got to simply relax into the day. Even the youngest members of the group, the Tong child's age and younger, carried that same tension because an eagle circling overhead does not check identification before it dives. It is worth sitting with that feeling for a second, uncomfortable as it is. Somewhere underneath the version of you reading this, in a heated room, with food a few steps away in a refrigerator, there's a body built by millions of mornings exactly like the one we just described. That inheritance did not disappear. It just stopped having anywhere honest to go. For a very long time, the only defense against that fear was numbers, noise, and speed, running together, watching each other's backs, hoping the group was simply too much trouble for a predator to bother with. That worked some of the time. It was never going to be enough on its own, forever. Try this yourself sometime. Pick up two rocks and attempt to strike one off the other into a symmetrical, teardrop-shaped blade with a cutting edge on both sides. Most people, on their first 100 attempts, produce a pile of useless gravel and a bruised thumb. Homo erectus produced Acheulean hand axes and did it by the millions. The technology first shows up around 1.76 million years ago at a site called Cocosili in Kenya, and it stays in continuous use across 3 continents for well over 1 million years. Nothing else humans have ever invented, no religion, no government, no single tool has ever had that kind of staying power. To make one properly, you first need to know your materials. Flint fractures one way, quartzite fractures another. Basalt behaves differently again. A skilled toolmaker had to understand the internal grain of stone the way a woodworker understands the grain of oak, invisible until you already know exactly what you're looking for. Then comes the striking itself. A first pass with a hard hammerstone to rough out the basic shape. Then, critically, a second pass using a softer hammer, sometimes made of bone, antler, or hardwood, to thin the edges without shattering the whole piece. Get the angle wrong by even a few degrees, and months of searching for the right stone is wasted in one bad swing. At Boxgrove, in southern England, archaeologists uncovered hand axes so precisely made, so evenly worked on every edge, that modern flint knappers studying them describe the skill required in the same breath as fine woodworking or blacksmithing. This was not fumbling. This was mastery. Researchers Kathy Schick and Nicholas Toth, working out of Indiana University, spent years personally learning to replicate these tools from scratch, using nothing but the same methods available 1 million years ago. It took them a long time to get good at it. That alone should tell you something about what we are dealing with here. Now, consider that nobody is born knowing how to do this. Every single toolmaker across those thousands of generations had to be shown, corrected, and shown again, almost certainly starting in childhood, almost certainly under the eye of someone older who had already put in the years themselves. That is not a hobby. That is an apprenticeship, running in parallel with every other survival task, taking up real hours of real days for years at a time, before a young member of the group could be trusted to make a hand axe good enough to actually rely on. In the 21st century, a researcher named Dietrich Stout put modern volunteers through exactly that training, then scanned their brains while they worked. The regions that lit up during advanced toolmaking overlapped heavily with regions involved in language and complex planning. Making a good hand axe and speaking a real sentence may draw on more of the same wiring than anyone expected. Stout also found something else worth sitting with. His volunteers learned fastest not from written instructions or verbal explanation alone, but from watching closely, repeatedly, and being corrected in person. Teaching a hand axe seems to require a body standing next to another body, hands guiding hands, in a way words on their own could never fully replace. Later toolmakers pushed the whole approach even further with a method archaeologists call Levallois technique, carefully shaping a stone core in advance so that a single, precise strike would pop off a flake of a predetermined size and shape, decided before the final blow was ever thrown. That is planning several steps ahead, held entirely in the mind before a single piece of stone actually moves. At Boxgrove, excavators found napping floors littered with tens of thousands of stone flakes concentrated in single small areas, evidence of the same specific spots being visited and reused again and again, likely because the toolmakers already knew, from memory and experience, exactly where the good stone could reliably be found. A single finished hand axe represents dozens of individual decisions, chained together in exact sequence, each one dependent on the last. Strike here, rotate the stone this much, strike again, check the edge, correct the angle. Miss one step badly enough, and the entire piece can shatter, wasting hours of accumulated effort in under a second. Modern researchers who have tried to relearn this from scratch consistently report the same humbling experience. It takes weeks simply to stop ruining good stone, and months, sometimes years, to produce anything close to the symmetry and precision found casually scattered across Acheulean sites by the hundred. Which means a truly excellent toolmaker within any given group likely held a genuinely valuable position. Someone whose finished pieces might be worth trading, worth requesting specifically, worth apprenticing under for years in the hope of one day matching that same steady, practiced hand. Researchers examining the tiny scars left behind on struck flakes have found a consistent pattern across huge numbers of Acheulean tools, one strongly associated with right-handed strikes. That level of consistency, repeated across an entire population in an enormous span of time, suggests handedness itself and the brain lateralization that comes with it was already firmly established this early in our lineage. That detail matters more than it first appears. In modern humans, strong hand preference is tied closely to specialized brain regions that also handle sequential, structured tasks, including language. Finding that same right-handed signature a million years deep adds one more small thread connecting toolmaking and communication far earlier than most people would ever assume. Good toolmaking stone was not always close at hand, and its scarcity shaped behavior on its own. Groups clearly knew where the best material could be found, sometimes returning to the exact same quarry sites generation after generation, treating a reliable source of fine-grained rock as something worth remembering, worth planning a route around, worth passing down as knowledge in its own right. Tools this valuable were also clearly repaired rather than discarded. Archaeologists studying edge whereon Acheulean hand axes regularly find evidence of resharpening. A dulled edge deliberately struck again to renew its cutting ability, extending the working life of a single, hard-won piece of stone well beyond its first use. Regional style even varied in ways that hint at something close to local tradition. Hand axes recovered in parts of India reach unusually large sizes, some approaching the length of a forearm, a distinct regional habit that persisted across generations in that specific area, while other regions kept theirs consistently smaller and more manageable. A regional habit like that does not travel through instinct alone. It travels the same way any craft tradition travels, through watching, correcting, and repeating, generation folding into generation, until a particular shape simply became the accepted, expected way things were done in that one specific corner of the ancient world. Picture the actual sound of a productive afternoon spent this way. Stone striking stone in a steady, practiced rhythm, pausing every so often for a thumb to test an edge, a low exchange of words or gestures between an older worker and a younger one watching closely, learning by proximity rather than instruction alone. That rhythm repeated itself across an area of the world stretching from southern Africa to the edges of Asia, carried by populations who never met each other, who never shared a language, and who nonetheless arrived at a strikingly similar solution to the exact same problem: shape a rock so it holds an edge and fits comfortably in the hand. Whether that similarity came from shared ancestry, independent discovery, or some mix of both remains genuinely debated. What is not debated is the result: a technology stable enough, useful enough, and teachable enough to outlive every single individual who ever picked up a hammerstone to make one. There is something almost moving about an object this ordinary lasting this long. No name attached to its inventor. No single moment of credit. Just a slowly perfected shape, refined by anonymous hands across more generations than anyone could ever count, until it became, quietly, one of the most successful designs our entire species has ever produced. That anonymous, patient craftsmanship was about to meet its true test, not in a quiet workshop, but out in the open, against something enormous, under pressure, with every hyena in earshot listening for exactly the sound a fresh kill makes when it finally goes down. It is a strange thought to sit with, that the same careful, patient hands capable of shaping something this refined were, within the hour, about to be plunged wrist deep into something considerably less delicate. Skill in this world rarely stayed confined to one single, tidy use for very long. It is worth remembering that not every attempt at a hand axe succeeded. Excavation sites are littered with rejected cores and abandoned, half-finished pieces, the quiet, ordinary failures of an apprentice or even an expert, having simply an off day, discarded without ceremony the same way any craftsman today sets aside a ruined piece of work. Which reframes the entire picture. This was not busy work to pass idle hours around a fire. Toolmaking was likely one of the primary jobs, arguably the primary skilled trade, around which in early communities' days, teaching, and even social status were organized. Picture it less like a caveman swinging a club, and more like a village blacksmith. Someone whose hands you would want on your side, whose knowledge took years to earn, and whose finished work you would trust your life to, because very often you actually did. And that trusted, hard-won piece of stone was about to be tested somewhere far more chaotic than a quiet workshop. Out on open ground, against something enormous, with everyone's next meal and every hyena in earshot hanging on how well it had been made. At Box Grove, on the southern coast of England, roughly 500,000 years ago, someone stood over the body of a wild horse with a freshly made hand axe and got to work. The cut marks left in the bone are still visible today, and they tell a story archaeologists can read almost like a transcript. Deep in Kenya, at a site called Sali, the scale gets even more dramatic. Elephant remains found alongside stone tools show clear signs of deliberate butchery. Animals that could weigh several tons, brought down or scavenged, then stripped of meat, fat, marrow, and hide by hominins armed with nothing sharper than worked rock. Picture the actual scene because it was not calm. An animal that size draws attention fast. Hyenas, lions, vultures circling within minutes, sometimes before the carcass has even stopped twitching. Whatever meat a group was going to get out of that kill had to be taken quickly or not at all. This was not a solitary hunter with a single hand axe. Cut mark density and distribution at these sites suggest coordinated group effort. Multiple people working different parts of the body at once, moving with the kind of practice division of labor that had clearly been done before. Someone opened the belly first, going for the organ meat and fat, the most calorie-dense parts and the fastest to spoil. Someone else worked the limbs, stripping long muscle in sheets. Someone else may have been holding stones back in reserve, in case the first tools chipped or dulled mid-task, which they often did. Every one of those roles had to be learned. Cutting through hide is nothing like cutting through muscle. Separating a joint at the right point takes real anatomical knowledge. Knowledge earned the hard way, through years of doing exactly this over and over on animal after animal. For decades, researcher Louis Binford argued that early hominins were mainly scavengers, arriving late to carcasses already picked over by lions and hyenas, surviving on scraps rather than actively hunting. That theory forced archaeologists to look far more closely at exactly how and when those cut marks were made. The answer turned out to sit in the order of the marks themselves. Where hominin cut marks appear underneath carnivore tooth marks on the same bone, cut first, chewed later, that sequence points to hominins reaching the body first, meaning active hunting or extremely fast, aggressive confrontation over a fresh kill, not leftover scavenging. In 1994, at a coal mine near Schöningen in Germany, workers uncovered a set of wooden spears, roughly 300,000 years old, expertly balanced and shaped like modern javelins, found alongside the butchered remains of nearly 20 horses at the edge of what was once a lake. That is not opportunistic scavenging. That is an ambush planned around a known watering point, executed with purpose-built weapons that someone had carved, balanced, and carried there specifically for this exact use. Hunting, real, deliberate, coordinated hunting, was already fully part of the toolkit hundreds of thousands of years before anyone thought it possible. Some butchery sites also show caches of stone tools left behind in advance, deliberately stored near known animal crossing points or watering holes, ready and waiting for the next opportunity. rather than carried the whole distance from home camp on the day itself. That single detail changes the whole picture again. This was not desperate, last-minute improvisation. It was logistics, planned days or weeks in advance, betting correctly that a valuable animal would eventually cross that exact stretch of ground again. And once the meat was down, the smell of blood and open organs drew more than hyenas. Flies arrived almost instantly. Vultures began circling within minutes. The clock on a kill this size was never generous, sometimes closer to 20 minutes of relatively safe working time before serious competition showed up demanding its share. And the whole time, someone had to be watching the tree lean. A butchery sight is loud. It smells like blood from a mile off, and it draws every predator and scavenger for miles straight toward the one spot where your entire group has its head down and its hands full. Excavations across the Allard-Saley Basin reveal this was not a single dramatic afternoon repeated once. The same general area shows evidence of butchery activity recurring across hundreds of thousands of years, generation after generation returning to a landscape that reliably funneled large game through the same corridors, near the same water, again and again. Anthropologist Richard Lee, studying the modern Joansea sand, documented a striking social custom built directly around a fresh kill, one hunters call insulting the meat. Even a spectacular hunt gets described afterward with exaggerated modesty and mockery, a deliberate cultural mechanism for keeping a successful hunter from becoming arrogant enough to threaten the group's equal sharing of food. If some version of that same social pressure existed far earlier, and the archaeological pattern of shared, communal butchery sites suggests it plausibly did, then a good hunter earning respect without earning outsized power over the group's food supply may be a very old, very deliberate piece of social engineering, not a modern invention at all. The physical toll of this labor shows up quietly in the bones of the people who did it. Heel fractures in hand and wrist bones, consistent with the kind of blunt trauma a slipped stone tool or a struggling carcass can cause, appear often enough across fossil remains from butchery-associated sites to suggest injury here was routine, expected, and simply worked through. A kill this size also forced an immediate decision about the rest of the day, and sometimes the rest of the week. Move on immediately with as much meat as could be carried, or stay close, guarding the remains against scavengers, drying strips of meat over a fire if one could be kept burning, buying a few more days of food at the cost of staying exposed in one predictable, blood-scented spot. Either choice carried real risk. Moving too soon might mean abandoning meat that could have fed the group for days. Staying too long might mean a pride of lions eventually deciding the reward was worth contesting directly, no matter how many humans stood between them and the kill. By the time the last strip of meat was finally cut free, the people doing the cutting were exhausted, bloodied to the elbow, and almost certainly aware, in some wordless way, of exactly how much their entire immediate future now depended on what they carried away from that single spot of torn ground. That awareness did not fade once the carcass was gone. It carried straight into the walk home, into the fire that would cook what had been won, and into every single calculation about how far this one lucky kill could realistically be stretched before hunger came looking again. None of it happened at a comfortable pace, either. Every single one of these butchery events sat inside a body that had already walked a considerable distance simply to reach the carcass in the first place. A body that was, by this point in the story, becoming remarkably specialized at exactly the kind of sustained, punishing distance. Consider what all of this actually demanded from a single body in a single day. The scan at dawn, the walk to reach the carcass, the frantic, skilled hour of cutting, the walk back home again, carrying the reward. This was never one task. It was an entire relay of enormous physical and mental demands, run back to back, with no substitute waiting on the sidelines. And every one of those relay legs depended entirely on a body built to keep moving well past the point most animals would already have stopped. That endurance was not a lucky accident of anatomy. It was the actual product on offer, the single trait this entire lineage had spent generations quietly perfecting. Children almost certainly had their own role in a scene like this, too young for the cutting itself, but old enough to carry water, gather firewood for the smoking racks, or simply keep watch from a safer distance, absorbing the entire process visually years before their own hands were trusted with a blade. A single successful kill of this size could mean weeks of food, dried, or shared out fast before it spoiled, fat reserves that might be the difference between surviving a lean season or not. A failed one, driven off by hyenas before the real cutting even started, could mean walking away with nothing but bruises and a lost afternoon. That is an enormous amount riding on a single hour of frantic, focused, physically brutal labor, done in the open, in the heat, with an audience of teeth waiting just out of reach for the smallest mistake or moment of hesitation. It is worth remembering this was not an occasional dramatic event. Sites like Allard-Saley show this pattern repeated again and again across huge stretches of time, which means this exact kind of high-stakes, high-speed group labor was, for long periods, simply what a good day at work looked like. None of it happened by luck alone. Finding that carcass in the first place, getting there before the scavengers did, meant covering serious ground day after day on foot in a body that was going to have to be extraordinarily good at one specific thing above almost everything else. Simply not stopping. A kudu can outrun a human easily for the first mile. It cannot outrun a human for 3 hours in the full heat of an African afternoon, and that gap is not an accident. It is the entire hunting strategy known as persistence hunting, and it may be one of the oldest deliberate tactics we have. Most four-legged animals cool themselves mainly by panting, and panting does not work well while sprinting. So a hunter does not try to outrun the animal. He simply keeps it moving again and again, never letting it fully rest, until its own body temperature climbs past what it can survive, and it simply collapses. This is not theory. Researcher Louis Liebenberg documented modern sand hunters in the Kalahari Desert doing exactly this, tracking a single kudu for hours across brutal heat, reading hoof prints in sand, predicting where the animal would head next, until it finally went down, exhausted, and they were still standing. A body built for that kind of hunt looks specific, and in 2004 researchers Dennis Bramble and Daniel Lieberman laid out exactly how specific. Long legs, short toes, a springy arch in the foot, a ligament running down the back of the neck, found in humans and horses, built for stabilizing the head during sustained running, and almost entirely absent in apes. Even the sheer number of sweat glands packed into human skin is unusual among mammals. An entire cooling system apes simply do not have in the same density. We are among primates, strangely, almost uniquely built to run long distances in open heat without overheating. That is not a coincidence. That is a hunting strategy engineered into the body over generations. Bramble and Lieberman cataloged more than 24 separate features of the human body that make sense only in the context of sustained running, not walking. Enlarged semicircular canals in the inner ear for balance at speed. A tall, springy Achilles tendon that stores and releases energy like a coiled spring with every stride. A prominent gluteus maximus that does almost nothing during a gentle walk, but fires hard to keep the trunk upright during a real run. A galloping antelope, by contrast, cannot pant and gallop at the same time, since the same muscles used for breathing are locked into the rhythm of the stride itself. It has to choose sprint fast and hold its breath, or slow down and cool off. Given no chance to ever fully slow down, its body temperature simply keeps climbing until something gives out. Modern researchers have documented a strikingly similar tradition among the Raramuri, sometimes called the Tarahumara, of northern Mexico, a people famous for running extraordinary distances across canyon terrain, a living echo of exactly the same physiological toolkit this chapter has been describing. Researcher Louis Liebenberg has argued for something bigger sitting underneath all of this, calling it the tracking hypothesis. Reading footprints in sand, judging their freshness, guessing an animal's likely next move from the depth and spacing of its stride is itself a form of structured reasoning, testing a guess against evidence and revising it, arguably an early ancestor of scientific thinking itself. None of it came without real risk. A hunter 3 hours from camp, deep into a chase, was also 3 hours from water, from help if a snake bit an ankle, from shelter if the weather turned. Persistence hunting was a bet, paid for in distance and thirst, against an animal that, if the chase failed, simply walked away unharmed. Cross-sectional analysis of fossil limb bones backs up just how demanding this life actually was on the body. Femurs from Homo erectus show noticeably thicker, more robust cortical bone than earlier hominins like Homo habilis. Exactly the kind of reinforcement bone develops in response to sustained, repeated mechanical loading over a lifetime of hard use. Picture the actual sensation of one of these chases stretched across real hours. Lungs burning steadily rather than desperately. Sweat soaking through in a way no fur-coated animal could manage. Feet finding their rhythm on hot, uneven ground, mile after mile, long after any sensible predator would have already quit and turned back. And somewhere ahead, entirely unaware it was losing a contest it could not physically win, an animal built for a single explosive burst of speed kept trying the only strategy its own body understood: sprint, rest, sprint again, each cycle a little weaker than the one before it. That mismatch, patience against panic, endurance against a burst of speed that cannot be sustained, is the entire hunt in miniature, and it is not a bad description of quite a lot of what this documentary has already shown you about how this species tends to win. A body engineered this thoroughly for distance did not switch itself off the moment the sun went down, either. It needed real recovery, real rest, and real food to repair the damage of a day like this. Which is exactly why the next major shift in this story mattered as much as it did, a discovery that changed how much of that recovery time a group could actually count on getting. There's a certain grim poetry in realizing that a body this exquisitely designed to keep moving was also eventually going to get injured by exactly the same relentless motion: a twisted ankle, a strained hip, a break that would not heal quickly enough to keep pace with everyone else. Children too young to keep pace over these enormous distances presented their own quiet daily puzzle. Carried on hips, on shoulders, or in slings, adding real weight to an already demanding walk, a cost every single adult in the group would have absorbed without much discussion at all. The skeleton of Homo erectus, best known from the remarkably complete Nariakotome boy found near Kenya's Lake Turkana, shows this same body plan already largely in place, close to 1.6 million years ago. Long-limbed, narrow-hipped, built less like a climber and more like a marathon runner who does not yet know the word marathon. None of this was reserved for hunting alone. Every single day, whether or not a chase happened, groups had to cover serious distance simply to find enough food. Modern hunter-gatherer studies put daily foraging distances somewhere around 10 to 15 kilometers, and often considerably more when resources thinned out. 10 to 15 kilometers a day, on foot, in the heat, carrying children, carrying tools, carrying whatever food had already been gathered, then repeating it tomorrow and the day after for an entire lifetime. There was no rest day built into that schedule. The body simply had to be capable of it, or the body did not survive long. And there was no fixed home waiting at the end of it either, not in the way we mean that we're now. Groups moved with the seasons, with water, with the animals themselves, following resources across enormous ranges rather than returning each night to one unchanging shelter. Bone density studies on fossil remains from this era show exactly what you would expect from that kind of life: thick, dense limb bones shaped by decades of repeated mechanical stress, evidence baked directly into the skeleton of thousands upon thousands of miles walked, run, and carried. At Illirit, in Kenya, researchers uncovered a set of fossilized footprints dated to roughly 1.5 million years ago, left by Homo erectus walking across soft mud that later hardened into stone. Biomechanical analysis by researcher Kevin Hadala found the stride, the arch, and the weight distribution nearly indistinguishable from a modern barefoot human walking the same surface today. That means the fundamental mechanics of human walking, the exact motion carrying you across a room right now, was already essentially finished and functioning 1.5 million years ago, refined by natural selection into a genuinely efficient long-distance machine long before anything else about the human story had caught up to it. Researcher Herman Ponser has measured exactly how efficient that machine really is, comparing the energy cost of human walking against chimpanzees moving the same distance. Human walking burns dramatically less energy per mile than chimpanzee locomotion, a quiet, built-in fuel advantage that made covering enormous daily distances at least metabolically survivable. Bipedalism bought something else, too, easy to take for granted now. Free hands, a body that can walk for hours while also carrying a tool, a carcass, a child, or a gathered armload of plants, rather than needing all 4 limbs simply to move forward, is a body built for exactly the kind of multitasking this entire film keeps circling back to. Seasonal movement was rarely random wandering either. Groups very likely tracked the same broad migratory patterns as the herds they depended on, arriving at known grazing grounds or water sources roughly when the animals themselves were expected to arrive, a rhythm closer to following an old, memorized calendar than simply drifting in whatever direction looked promising that morning. None of that memorized calendar came free. It had to be learned, tested across failed years and lucky ones, and carried forward the same way every other piece of hard-won knowledge in this film has been carried forward, one exhausted, dust-covered evening at a time. Think about what that actually costs a person day after day, year after year. Joints wearing down, feet cracked and calloused, a body that never really gets to stop moving long enough to fully heal from the last long walk before the next one begins. Which raises an obvious, uncomfortable question. In a life built entirely around constant motion, what happened the day a person simply could not walk anymore? In the Republic of Georgia, at a site called Dmanisi, researchers found the skull of a Homo erectus man who died roughly 1.77 million years ago, having lost nearly every tooth in his mouth years before death. The bone around the empty sockets had fully healed over. Heal bone means time, years of it, which means this man lived long after he lost the physical ability to chew tough meat or fibrous plants on his own, in a world with no soft porridge, no blended food, nothing gentle waiting at the bottom of a jar. Somebody kept him alive anyway. Pre-chewed food, perhaps passed to him directly. Softened plants, pounded meat, something prepared specifically because his own body could no longer manage the raw version everyone else was eating. That is not an accident of preservation. That is a decision repeated daily for years. Further along the timeline, in Iraq, a Neanderthal skeleton known as Shanidar 1 tells an even harder version of the same story. Blind in one eye, a withered, likely useless right arm, amputated below the elbow at some point in life. Evidence of a serious skull fracture and hearing loss. He still lived into what counted as old age for his time. A man with one eye, one working arm, and damaged hearing does not survive alone on the open steppe for years. Someone walked beside him on uneven ground. Someone shared meat that he could not have hunted or butchered himself. Someone repeatedly chose to keep him inside the circle of the group rather than let him fall behind. Shanidar 1 was first excavated between 1957 and 1961 by archaeologist Ralph Seletsky, and decades later, researcher Eric Trinkoz revisited the same bones with updated methods, confirming just how long this man's injuries had been healed over before death. Whatever community surrounded him, they had committed to keeping him alive for years, not days. Archaeologist Glenn Isaac proposed something called central place foraging to describe how early hominin groups likely organized around a shared base, some members ranging out to hunt or gather while others, including the injured, the very young, and nursing mothers, stayed closer, with food actively carried back and divided among everyone regardless of who went out that day. That kind of arrangement only works if sharing is reliable, not occasional. A group that only fed the people who personally caught that day's meal would have no mechanism at all for keeping someone like the Manasai man or a Shanidar one alive for years past the point they could contribute physically. Preparing food soft enough for a toothless mouth took real, deliberate labor in a world with no pots, no fire suited to boiling, and no blender. Meat pounded between two stones into something closer to paste. Plant matter chewed first by someone else and passed along, an intimate, unglamorous act that leaves no fossil trace, but almost certainly happened repeatedly for years of stretch. Evolutionary biologists studying cooperation, building on ideas from researchers like William Hamilton and Robert Trivers, note that this kind of costly caregiving generally persists in a species only when it pays off over time, through close kinship, through reliable reciprocity, or through a group's basic survival, depending on the total number of skilled, experienced adults it manages to keep alive. An older member of the group, even one who could no longer hunt or walk far, still carried decades of accumulated memory, exactly the kind of memory that would later be covered in this film as a survival advantage in its own right. Keeping that person alive was not pure sentiment. It was also quietly an investment. Archaeologist Penny Spikins has spent much of her career cataloging exactly this kind of evidence across the Neanderthal and early human record, building a case that compassion, real, costly, sustained compassion, is not a late arriving layer of civilization polished onto a violent core. It is old enough to belong to the basic operating instructions of these species, not an optional upgrade. At La Pharisie, in France, archaeologists uncovered multiple Neanderthal burials clustered together at a single rock shelter, including several infants, laid to rest with a consistency and repetition that argues strongly against coincidence. Whatever grief or ritual accompanied those small burials, it happened more than once in the same trusted place across more than one generation. Shanidar Cave, already introduced earlier in this chapter through the remarkable survival of Shanidar 1, held other individuals worth mentioning too. Shanidar 3 shows a healed rib injury alongside other trauma, evidence of a body that absorbed serious damage and kept living regardless, inside a community willing, once again, to carry that cost. Researchers attempting to estimate the actual caloric cost of supporting a severely injured adult, someone who can contribute little or no foraging labor for weeks or months, put the burden at a genuinely significant share of small groups' total daily energy budget, a cost paid willingly, apparently, again and again, across an enormous range of sites and species. It is tempting to look at all of this softness and assume these communities were simply gentle by nature. The truth sitting alongside it, the murdered skull from the very first chapter of this film, the coordinated group violence still ahead, refuses that easy comfort. Care and cruelty apparently lived inside the very same communities, sometimes inside the very same year. What the fed carried and mended bodies covered in this chapter prove, at minimum, is that cruelty was never the whole story, not even close. Somewhere in every one of these communities, someone was doing the unglamorous, uncelebrated work of keeping another person alive, purely because they had decided that person was still worth keeping. Picture the specific, quiet exhaustion of that role, slowing your own pace to match someone who can barely walk, giving up the better portion of a hard-won meal without ceremony, without applause, simply because it was understood, without needing to be said aloud, that this was what you did for each other. None of that labor left a monument. No hand axe, no painted cave, no pierced shell survives to mark it. Only a healed bone, decades later, in a body that had no business surviving as long as it did, quietly outlasting every explanation except the simple one, that somebody chose to make sure it did. That kind of care did not stay confined to daylight hours either. It very likely found its fullest expression after dark. Once a new invention gave every one of these communities something they had never quite had before, a stretch of safe, lit time with nothing forcing them to spend it on anything but each other. It is tempting to imagine this kind of care as automatic, something that simply happened without effort or thought. It almost certainly was not. Somebody had to notice the injury first, decide it mattered, and then keep noticing day after day, long after the initial shock of the accident had faded into ordinary, exhausting routine. It is easy to romanticize this kind of care from a comfortable distance. It would not have felt romantic at the time. It would have felt like one more exhausting obligation stacked on top of an already brutally demanding day, chosen anyway, over and over, by people who had every practical excuse available to choose otherwise. There is an earlier, quieter case too, a Homo erectus woman known by her catalog number, Kin AR 1808, found near Kenya's Lake Turkana. Her bones show a condition consistent with vitamin A poisoning, likely from eating too much predator liver, which causes painful bone lesions and can leave a person bedridden for weeks at a stretch. Weeks bedridden, in a world with no beds, no fixed shelter, and a group that had to keep moving to eat. If she was carried, fed, and protected through that illness rather than abandoned, and the healing in her bones suggests exactly that, then this was already true well over 1.5 million years ago. None of this fits the old, hollow image of early humans running on pure survival instinct, discarding anyone who slowed the group down. Discarding people is the easy strategy, biologically speaking. Carrying them is the expensive one, in calories, in time, in risk to everyone else. And they paid that cost anyway, over and over across different species, different continents, different hundreds of thousands of years. That is not incidental kindness. That looks a great deal like a rule the group actually lived by. It means the day-to-day rhythm we have been building up across this film, waking, watching, walking, hunting, cutting, napping stone, also had room in it for something slower and less glamorous. Someone chewing food soft for another mouth. Someone adjusting their pace to match a person who could no longer keep up. That labor left almost no dramatic trace. No cut marks, no hand axes, nothing you could put behind glass in a museum case. Only a healed jaw, a mended bone, a skeleton that lived years longer than the injuries alone should have allowed, quietly testifying to hours of care nobody thought to record. Deep inside Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, well over a kilometer from the entrance, archaeologists found burned bone fragments and ash so far underground that no wildfire could ever have reached it. Dated to roughly 1 million years ago, it stands among the strongest evidence we have of fire being deliberately carried, tended, and used, not just encountered by accident. A find at Gesher Banat Yaakov in Israel pushes the pattern further, showing signs of fire used again and again in the same spots over long stretches of time. Not one lucky ember, but a habit, a skill, something a group came to depend on and knew how to keep alive. Before this, night was simply the most dangerous part of any day, spent hidden, still, and largely helpless against whatever hunted in the dark. Fire changed the terms completely. Large cats and hyenas that would happily approach a sleeping group in silence generally will not walk toward flame. For the first time, a group could stay awake after sunset without spending every second of it in raw fear. That single shift, safety after dark, may be one of the most underrated turning points in this entire story, because it did not just add light. It added time, real, usable, waking hours that had never existed before. It is worth being honest about what controlling fire actually meant at this stage. This was very likely not yet fire making from scratch, striking sparks, or drilling friction into tinder. It was fire capturing, taking an ember from a natural wildfire, sparked by lightning, and keeping it alive deliberately, fed, sheltered, and carried onward rather than letting it simply die out. Keeping an ember alive across a journey was its own quiet, constant labor, smoldering material wrapped and carried carefully, checked at every stop, fed the moment it showed signs of fading. Losing that ember on a long march could mean days without fire until the group got lucky enough to find another wild source. True fire making, generating flame on demand through friction or percussion rather than simply preserving a found ember, likely came much later. Evidence from Kizim Cave in Israel, dated to around 300,000 years ago, shows recurring, structured hearths used again and again in the exact same spot, suggesting fire had, by then, become fully reliable rather than a precious, fragile resource. Fire also transformed the wooden spear technology covered earlier in this film. Hardening a sharpened wooden point briefly over flame drives out moisture and stiffens the fibers, producing a noticeably tougher, more effective tip, a small trick with an outsized payoff for anyone hunting large, dangerous animals. Richard Wrangham's research went further than theory alone. In controlled feeding studies, he found that both humans and other animals extract measurably more usable energy from cooked starches and proteins than from the identical food eaten raw, since heat begins breaking down the material before digestion even starts. Multiply that efficiency gain across every single meal, every single day across an entire lifetime, and the numbers compound into something significant, a steady caloric surplus that a demanding, expensive brain could draw on gradually, generation after generation, in a way a purely raw diet made considerably harder to sustain. And fire did one more thing worth naming plainly. It marked territory after dark the way nothing else could. A visible signal readable from a considerable distance, telling any other group scanning the horizon exactly where people already were and exactly how far away it might be wiser to make camp instead. Richard Wrangham has proposed a relationship with fire likely unfolded in stages, starting with simple tolerance, watching natural wildfires burn without panic, the way researchers have actually observed wild chimpanzees in Senegal calmly monitoring the progress of savanna brush fire from a safe distance rather than fleeing outright. From tolerance came conservation, the deliberate keeping of a found ember alive, and only much later, true production, striking or drilling a flame into existence from nothing. Each stage represents a real leap in trust and understanding, built slowly, likely across hundreds of thousands of years rather than any single lightning strike of insight. Smoke itself carried a practical benefit easy to overlook. A steady curtain of smoke around a sleeping area keeps biting insects at bay, including the mosquitoes responsible for spreading malaria and other diseases. A small, constant defense against threats too small to see, layered directly on top of fire's defense against threats too large to miss. Archaeologists identify ancient hearths through a specific signature left in the ground itself. Layers of compacted ash, fragments of rock cracked and reddened by repeated heating, and charcoal fragments concentrated tightly enough to rule out a passing wildfire. That signature is what let researchers confidently date sites like Wonderwork and Kizim as genuine, maintained fire use rather than lucky coincidence. A secure fire also likely allowed larger numbers of people to sleep close together on the ground rather than scattered individually up in separate trees, concentrating a group's collective vigilance into one well-lit, well-defended spot instead of leaving each sleeper to fend for themselves alone in the dark canopy. There may even be something quietly physiological sitting inside all of this. Modern researcher Christopher Lynn has studied what happens to people simply watching a fire burn, finding measurable drops in blood pressure the longer someone sits and watches flame, a small, calming effect that may have made the fire circle not just safe, but genuinely restful in a way the anxious daylight hours almost never were. Picture the actual scene one more time, slower this time. Faces lit from below, orange light catching the underside of a jaw, an eyebrow, the top of a raised hand. Shadows thrown backward onto rock or onto nothing at all, moving slightly with every flicker in a way the daylight world never once allowed. That flickering light did something else worth naming. It made faces genuinely easier to read. Small expressions catching the glow in a way they never would in flat, even daylight, adding an entirely new emotional texture to whatever was being communicated across that circle, wordless or otherwise. A day that had always ended the moment useful light disappeared now had a genuine second act, shorter than daylight, more intimate than anything the group had access to before, and entirely, newly, theirs to fill however they chose. It is worth pausing on just how strange that must have felt the very first few times it happened. An entire lifetime of ancestors who had only ever known night as something to survive, quietly discovering that this particular night, at least, simply did not require survival mode at all. That single shift in what night meant may be one of the most underappreciated turning points in this entire documentary. Quieter than a hand axe, less dramatic than a hunt, and yet responsible for creating the very first stretch of human time that existed purely for its own sake, rather than for pure survival. Children raised inside that new evening routine grew up with something no earlier generation had, a reliable, recurring window each day where the adults around them were not scanning the tree line, not calculating distance, simply present, close, and for once unhurried. Fire also solved the second, quieter problem sitting underneath everything covered so far in this film: cooking. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued that cooked food delivers dramatically more usable energy than raw food because heat breaks down tough fibers and proteins before a single tooth ever touches them. Less energy spent chewing and digesting meant more energy available for everything else a body needs, including, over enormous stretches of time, fueling the kind of expensive, demanding brain growth that would eventually separate later humans from everything that came before them. Roasted meat also meant less raw chewing time altogether. Hours previously spent grinding through tough, fibrous food freed up for something else entirely. A schedule that had been almost completely consumed by finding food and then physically processing it in the mouth suddenly had room to breathe. And that freed up time did not scatter randomly. It gathered quite literally in one physical spot, the fire itself, a single fixed point of warmth and light that an entire group could sit around, facing each other for the first sustained stretch of shared, unhurried time in the whole human day. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner, studying modern Johansi communities in the Kalahari, found something striking. Daytime conversation around these groups tends to be practical, economic, occasionally sharp-edged gossip about who did what to whom. Nighttime conversation around the fire shifts almost entirely into something else: stories. It is not hard to imagine the same shift happening the very first time a group sat safely around flame for long enough to get bored of silence. Daylight had always been for survival. This new, invented evening was for the first time for something else. Of course, none of this came free. Fire has to be fed constantly, watched constantly, protected from wind and rain and its own habit of spreading further than intended. Someone in every group almost certainly carried the specific, unglamorous responsibility of simply keeping it alive through the night. So the human day split cleanly into two very different halves for the first time in its long history. Daylight still built almost entirely around danger and hunger, the same as it had always been. And now, after dark, something genuinely new. A lit, guarded space with hours left over and absolutely nothing forcing anyone to fill that time with anything useful at all. In the Kabr Cave in Israel, in 1989, researchers found a Neanderthal hyoid bone, the small, delicate bone that anchors the muscles of the tongue and throat, dated to roughly 60,000 years ago. It is almost identical in shape to the one sitting in your own throat right now. A hyoid bone alone cannot prove someone spoke in full sentences. What it does prove is that the physical hardware for complex vocalization, the same hardware you're using right now if you're reading this out loud, was already in place in a close relative of ours, tens of thousands of years before any of it was ever written down. Genetic research has since found that Neanderthals carried a version of a gene called FOXP2, closely linked in modern humans to speech and language ability, almost identical to our own. Whatever was happening in that throat and that brain, it was not nothing. So what were the earliest words actually for? To find a plausible answer, researchers have looked at living primates, and vervet monkeys in particular offer a striking clue. Studied for decades by Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth, vervets use distinct, specific alarm calls, one sound for eagle, a different sound for leopard, another again for snake. Play a recording of the eagle call, and every vervet in earshot looks straight up. Play the leopard call, and they scramble into the trees. Play the snake call, and they stand upright, scanning the grass. These are not vague cries of distress. They are specific, information-carrying signals, and they change behavior instantly. If a monkey brain can manage that level of specific coded communication, then early hominins with larger brains, tighter social bonds, and a great deal more at stake almost certainly did at least as much, and very likely a great deal more. Researcher Kate Zuberbuller, studying putty-nosed monkeys in West Africa, found something even more striking than single fixed alarm calls. These animals could combine two distinct calls into a new sequence carrying a different meaning entirely from either call alone, a small but genuine hint of grammar, assembled out of simpler pieces deep in the primate family tree. Psychologist Michael Corballis has argued that spoken language may have grown out of gesture first, pointing, miming, showing, rather than sound alone. Gesture has an advantage, sound does not. You can mime the shape of an animal, the size of a threat, or the direction of water, with far more specific, flexible detail than a single fixed cry ever allows. Researchers Amy Pollock and Franz Duvall, comparing chimpanzee and bonobo communication, found that gestures were used far more flexibly and intentionally across different contexts than vocal calls, which tended to stay locked to specific emotional states. If our own ancestors leaned the same way, early communication may have been as much about the hands as the throat. Fossil skulls can hint at this too, in an indirect way. Paleoneurologist Ralph Holloway spent decades studying endocasts, detailed casts taken from the inside of fossil skulls, and found early impressions of a brain region called Broca's area, closely tied to language production in living humans, already faintly present in Homo habilis skulls dating back roughly 2 million years. A faint impression is not proof of speech. It is, at minimum, proof that the physical architecture associated with complex communication was already being laid down in the brain long before anything resembling a full spoken sentence likely existed. The discovery of mirror neurons, brain cells that fire both when an animal performs an action and when it simply watches another individual perform that same action, offered researchers a plausible bridge between watching a toolmaker work and eventually being able to describe that same action out loud. Put all of it together, and a rough picture starts to form. Not a sudden miracle where language switched on overnight, but a long, layered accumulation. Gesture, alarm call, combination, imitation, each piece reinforcing the others, slowly assembling into something with enough range to eventually carry more than a warning. Paleoanthropologist Dean Falk has proposed a strikingly tender possible origin sitting alongside all of this survival-focused theory. Losing thick body hair meant human infants could no longer cling unaided to a mother's fur the way other primate babies still do, forcing mothers to physically set their infants down more often and to reassure them with sound across a small distance instead of constant touch. That small, repeated act, putting a baby down and using the voice alone to soothe it, may be one of the oldest deliberate uses of vocal tone, completely separate from warning or coordination. A melodic, rhythmic sound meant purely to comfort, is something researcher Ellen Dissanayake has found in strikingly similar form across virtually every human culture ever studied, an apparent universal. Not every researcher agrees on how far Neanderthal communication actually went. Some point to lingering uncertainty around the exact internal shape of the hypoglossal canal, a nerve channel in the skull once thought to indicate speech capacity on its own, now considered a far less reliable measure than researchers originally hoped. Captive studies with other primates hint at just how large the remaining gap still is. A bonobo named Kanzi, studied for decades by researcher Sue Savage Rumbaugh, learned to use hundreds of abstract symbols meaningfully, an impressive achievement, and still fell dramatically short of the open-ended, endlessly combinable structure of even a young human toddler's ordinary speech. That gap is exactly why researchers remain cautious about pinning an exact date on full human language, complete with grammar, tense, and abstract storytelling. What the evidence supports confidently is a long runway, stretching across at least 1 million years, gradually assembling the pieces a modern sentence takes completely for granted. So somewhere between a scream warning of a predator and a lullaby sung to a fussing infant, the same basic vocal apparatus was already being asked to do 2 very different jobs: protect the group from an external threat and soothe the smallest, most helpless member of it. That split, danger on one side, tenderness on the other, may be the oldest fork this documentary has to offer. Imagine standing close enough to actually hear one of these exchanges, a sharp bark cutting across open ground, every head turning at once, followed minutes later by a low, murmured string of sound directed at nothing more dangerous than a tired, fussing child refusing to settle. Neither sound would mean much written down as plain text on a page. Heard in context, in the actual moment, surrounded by the actual stakes involved, both would have landed with total, immediate clarity, exactly the way a scream or a whispered comfort still lands on you today. No translation required. That is the piece easiest to lose sight of when a subject like language origins gets reduced to gene names and skull measurements. Underneath every single theory in this chapter sits something achingly simple. People trying to reach each other across the small, permanent distance between one mind and another, using whatever sound was closest at hand. That reaching did not stop at warnings and lullabies for very long. Once a group could trust a sound to carry real, specific meaning, it was only a matter of time before someone used that same trust to describe something that had already happened rather than something happening right now, and the entire idea of a shared story quietly slipped into existence. That slippage from warning to memory to something like narrative likely did not feel like a single invention to the people living through it. It would have felt like a small, useful trick that simply kept getting more useful, evening after evening, until nobody could quite remember a time before it existed at all. Every advance in this chapter still relied entirely on someone willing to listen patiently, closely, long enough for a new sound or a new gesture to actually mean something shared rather than something private. Communication was never a solo invention. It was always, from a very first alarm call onward, a joint project between at least 2 minds. Picture the actual uses. A distinct sound for predator sighted, a different one for water found 2 ridge lines over, another for stay still, and another entirely for follow me now. None of it poetry, all of it quite literally the difference between living through the afternoon and not. Coordinated group hunts, the kind covered earlier in this film, chasing prey across open ground for hours, or working fast around a butchered carcass before scavengers arrive, are extraordinarily difficult to pull off in total silence. Somebody had to be able to say, in effect, go left or drop it or now. So the honest, unglamorous answer is this. Before language was ever used to tell a joke, share a memory, or comfort a grieving parent, it was almost certainly a tool for staying alive, built the same way a hand axe was built, refined slowly generation after generation, because the alternative was silence, and silence got people killed. Keep that in mind because it will matter later. The same voice that once screamed a warning about a leopard in the grass was, tens of thousands of years down the line, going to be asked to do something it was never originally built for. Tell a story, comfort a stranger, carry a memory forward into a mind that had never lived through it. That voice was not there yet, not in this chapter. For now, it still mostly did one job, and did it well. It kept the group together, kept them warned, kept them moving in the same direction at the same moment, which was for a very long time exactly what survival actually required. There is no fence, no sign, no treaty written down anywhere. And yet, for a group living off a stretch of land, there was very clearly a line, understood by everyone in it, past which the risk of encountering another group rose sharply, and the welcome, if there was any welcome at all, could not be counted on. We cannot interview a Homo erectus about where their territory ended, but we can watch a living relative who shares roughly 99% of our DNA, and chimpanzee communities studied for decades at GOM in Tanzania offer an uncomfortably clear window into how this plays out. Jane Goodall's long-term observations at GOM documented something researchers came to call border patrols, small groups of adult males moving in tense silence along the edge of their territory, listening, checking for signs of neighboring chimps, ready to act fast if they found one alone. When those patrols found a lone male from a neighboring community, the outcome was frequently brutal, a coordinated, sustained attack by multiple animals against one, a level of planned, cooperative violence that unsettled even the researchers who had spent years assuming chimpanzee aggression was mostly noise and display. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued that this pattern, coalitions of males systematically eliminating rivals from neighboring groups, may run far deeper into our shared ancestry than anyone once assumed, a behavior present before humans and chimpanzees ever split on as separate evolutionary paths. The clearest documented case remains what researchers now call the 4-year war at GOM, between 1974 and 1978, when one chimpanzee community systematically tracked down and killed every adult male from a smaller splinter group that had broken away from it, until that entire community simply ceased to exist. That is not a single violent flare-up. That is a sustained, patient campaign carried out over years by animals capable of recognizing former companions, tracking them down specifically, and choosing violence deliberately rather than in a single moment of panic or provocation. Not every researcher reads this evidence the same way. Anthropologist Douglas Fry has pushed back hard against the idea that constant warfare defined early human life, pointing to numerous small-scale societies that show remarkably low rates of lethal conflict, and arguing that cooperation, not violence, was very often the more common daily reality. Both things can be true without canceling each other out. Most days, for most groups, likely passed without any violent encounter at all. But the capacity for a coordinated, sustained lethal conflict clearly existed, ready to be triggered under specific conditions, resource scarcity, territorial pressure, or a rival group simply getting too close for comfort. At a site called Nataruk, near Kenya's Lake Turkana, researcher Marta Mirazan-Lar and her team uncovered a group of at least 27 individuals dating back roughly 10,000 years, several showing clear signs of violent death, embedded projectile points, blunt force trauma, and in at least one case, bound wrists. Nataruk sits later on the timeline than most of this chapter's other evidence, but offers something rare, a clear, unambiguous, large-scale case of exactly the kind of intergroup violence that chimpanzee comparison predicts, preserved together in one place rather than scattered across isolated heel fractures. Whatever the true frequency, the underlying logic stayed remarkably consistent across species and across time. Numbers mattered. A larger, more cohesive group was harder to attack successfully and less likely to be attacked at all, which gave every one of the bonding behaviors covered earlier in this film: shared food, shared fire, shared care for the injured, an additional, colder purpose sitting quietly underneath the warmth. Economist Samuel Bowles compiled mortality data across numerous forager societies, ancient and recent, and found average death rates from intergroup violence sometimes approaching 14% of all adult deaths, a staggering figure compared to the well under 1% typically seen in large, modern state societies, even accounting for their far bloodier wars. Bowles has proposed something he calls parochial altruism, the theory that intense loyalty, sacrifice, and cooperation within a group and violent hostility toward outside groups may have evolved together as two sides of the exact same coin, each one reinforcing the survival value of the other under conditions of real, sustained competition. At Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, archaeologists uncovered a cemetery dated to roughly 13,000 years ago containing dozens of individuals, many bearing embedded stone projectile fragments directly in the bone, some showing multiple healed wounds layered over fresh, fatal ones, evidence of repeated violent conflict experienced across a single lifetime rather than one isolated incident. Multiple healed wounds followed, eventually by a fatal one described something specific and grim, a person who survived violence once or twice or more before it finally caught up with them for good, living for years under the ongoing background threat of exactly the kind of conflict this chapter has been describing. At Gam and at nearby Kabali, researchers observed something equally telling on the winning side of chimpanzee conflict. Communities that successfully drove out or eliminated a rival group did not simply celebrate. They expanded, absorbing the newly unguarded territory, gaining access to more fruit trees, more range, and, crucially, more resources to support future growth. Resource pressure, in other words, did not just make conflict more likely. Successful conflict actively relieved resource pressure, at least for the winning side, which created its own dark incentive, repeated again and again across enough generations to leave a permanent, uncomfortable mark on the underlying instincts of every descendant that followed. It is worth sitting with how ordinary most of this likely felt from the inside, rather than picturing constant battle. A boundary respected out of habit far more often than it was ever actually tested, a wary glance across open ground toward smoke rising from an unfamiliar fire, and then, most days, simply turning back toward familiar territory instead. That quiet, low-grade wariness, present under the surface of an otherwise unremarkable day, cost almost nothing to maintain and occasionally saved everything. It is a small, unglamorous kind of vigilance, easy to overlook next to an actual recorded skeleton bearing an actual healed wound, and yet it was very likely doing the majority of the real work. Underneath that wariness sat something this documentary keeps circling back to. A group is only as strong as the trust binding it together, and trust, it turns out, cuts in two directions at once, holding your own people closer precisely by holding everyone else a little further away. That same tightly bound trust was, at the very same time, capable of producing something with absolutely nothing to do with territory or danger at all. Inside the safety of a group willing to fight for its own, individuals had room to start caring about something new, how they themselves were seen, judged, and remembered by the very people they had chosen to trust. That is worth noticing on its own. A species dangerous enough to organize coordinated violence against outsiders is the exact same species tender enough to spend years feeding someone who could no longer feed themselves. Neither fact cancels the other one out. Both were simply true in the same communities at the same time. A child born into this world absorbed both lessons early, who counted as family and who counted as a threat, learning the difference the same way it learned to recognize a parent's face, gradually, constantly, through years of quiet observation rather than a single spoken rule. If that is true, then the same underlying wiring, tight loyalty within a group, sharp suspicion of anyone outside it, was very likely already sitting inside early hominin brains as well, ready to be triggered by exactly the kind of resource pressure and competition covered earlier in this film. Fossil evidence adds a quieter, more ambiguous layer to this picture. Heel fractures on forearm bones, the kind that occur when someone raises an arm to block a blow, show up across multiple hominin skeletons from this broad era, wounds consistent with interpersonal violence, though rarely provable beyond doubt for bone alone. None of this means constant warfare. Most days, most encounters between groups, if they happened at all, likely passed without violence, simply through distance, avoidance, and the enormous size of the land available compared to the small number of people spread across it. But the capacity was there, sitting quietly underneath the cooperation, the caregiving, the shared fire, the whole warm picture build up across the last several chapters. The same tight bond that let one hominin carry an injured companion for years could, under the wrong pressure, turn cold and lethal towards someone standing on the other side of a boundary that existed only in memory. That is not a contradiction. It is the same tool used two different ways. Loyalty is not automatically kindness. Sometimes loyalty is simply a very efficient description of exactly who you are willing to hurt on someone else's behalf. And once a group understands who counts as us and who counts as them, a second question follows almost immediately, and it has nothing to do with outsiders at all. Inside that trusted circle, how does a person actually stand out? How do you get noticed, respected, chosen by the only people whose opinion has ever mattered? At Blombos Cave, on the southern coast of South Africa, archaeologist Christopher Hinchelwood and his team found small nacreous shells, dated to roughly 75,000 years ago, each one deliberately pierced through with a small, precise hole in almost the same spot. Where patterns on those holes, smooth and rounded rather than sharp, matched exactly what you would expect from shells rubbed repeatedly against skin, cord, and each other. In other words, these were strung, worn, probably around a neck or wrist for long enough to leave a physical trace of the friction. A shell like this has no calories in it. It does not cut meat, start a fire, or fend off a predator. Every minute spent finding the right shell, drilling it without cracking it, and stringing it together was time taken directly away from food, rest, or safety. And people did it anyway, again and again. Even further back, at Bismound Cave in Morocco, researchers identified pierced shells dated to roughly 142,000 years ago, among the oldest deliberate ornaments found anywhere on the planet. This was not a single strange habit at one isolated site. It was already spreading. Similar pierced shells turned up at Skull Cave and Kafsa Cave in Israel, dated to somewhere between 100,000 and 135,000 years ago, telling the same story yet again across an entirely different landscape. Multiple, unconnected populations of early Homo sapiens appear to have reached for the same basic idea independently, or carried it with them as they spread. At Pinnacle Point, on South Africa's southern coast, researcher Curtis Marian and his team found ochre processing evidence dated to roughly 164,000 years ago, among the earliest signs anywhere of pigment being deliberately prepared, likely ground and mixed specifically for use on skin or material rather than simply picked up and rubbed on raw. Not every researcher agrees ochre was purely symbolic. Some have proposed more practical explanations sitting alongside the social ones. Ochre as a rudimentary sunscreen against harsh coastal light, as an insect repellent, or even as an ingredient in early adhesives used to half-stone points onto wooden shafts. Those explanations are not necessarily in competition with each other. A material can serve a practical purpose and carry symbolic weight at the same time, the way a wedding ring is both a functional object and a loaded piece of social meaning, worn on purpose, noticed on purpose by everyone who sees it. In Denisova Cave, in Siberia, researchers recovered a fragment of a bracelet made from dark green chlorite, dated to roughly 40,000 years old, drilled through with a hole so smooth and precise that some researchers believe it required a rotating, high-speed drilling technique far more advanced than anyone expected from that era. Evolutionary theorists sometimes describe this kind of costly, non-essential display using something called the handicap principle, the idea that a signal is trusted precisely because it is expensive to fake. A finely made bracelet or a perfectly drilled shell says, plainly, I had the time, skill, and resources to spare on this, which is itself a kind of information other members of the group are almost certainly reading closely. The oldest deliberate geometric mark we have found anywhere may not even belong to Homo sapiens at all. On the Indonesian island of Java, at a site called Trinil, a Homo erectus individual engraved a clear zigzag pattern into a freshwater mussel shell, dated by researcher Josephine Jordans and her team in 2014 to somewhere around 500,000 years ago. That single scratched pattern predates every Blombos bead, every piece of engraved ochre, and every Homo sapiens on the planet by hundreds of thousands of years. If it truly represents deliberate, symbolic mark-making, then this entire chapter's story starts far earlier, and with a far more surprising author than most people would ever expect. Skeptics push back reasonably here too. A pattern scratched in a shell could, in principle, result from a repetitive practical task, rather than deliberate symbolic intent, and researchers are careful to note the difference between a mark that clearly encodes meaning and a mark that simply looks orderly to a modern eye searching for significance. Anthropologist Mary Steiner has connected the rise of ornament used more broadly to population density, arguing that as groups grew larger and encountered strangers more frequently, having a fast, visible way to signal identity and allegiance became genuinely more valuable, a badge readable at a glance, long before anyone had time for a lengthy conversation. Ethnographic study of more recent societies consistently finds ornamentation tied closely to specific life transitions, marking the passage into adulthood, a new marriage, or a change in status within the group, moments a community wanted publicly, visibly acknowledged rather than left to pass quietly unnoticed. None of this really stopped. A modern tattoo, a wedding ring, a company logo stitched onto a jacket, all perform close to the same function a Blombo's shell once did, announcing something true about a person before that person has said a single word about themselves. Picture the actual moment a shell like that first went around someone's neck. A friend, or a parent, or a partner, tying the cord, stepping back to look, the small satisfaction of watching it settle exactly where it was meant to sit. That is not a scene from museum placard. That is a genuinely intimate human moment, tens of thousands of years old. And once that shell was worn out in public, every single person who noticed it was making a judgment, consciously or not, about the person wearing it. Skilled, connected, trusted enough to be given something this carefully made. None of that judgment needed a single spoken word to land. That is the quiet, permanent cost of living inside any group larger than yourself, prehistoric or otherwise. You're always, in some sense, being read. The shells simply made that reading a little easier to do at a glance, which is exactly why, 75,000 years later, we are all still doing some version of the same thing every single morning. Not everything the species made during the same broad era was meant to be seen at all, though. Some of it was made specifically to be hidden, carried deliberately into total darkness, for reasons that had nothing to do with being noticed by anyone at all. That contrast is worth sitting with. A species capable of dressing itself carefully for the eyes of its own community was at the very same time capable of creating something meant for absolutely no audience whatsoever. Work performed purely because the act itself, not the recognition afterward, was the entire point. Children growing up surrounded by ochre and shell ornament would have absorbed the underlying lesson early and completely. That appearance carries information, that a body can speak before a mouth ever opens, a lesson every single generation since has apparently found worth relearning all over again. Alongside the shells at Blombos, the same layers held something else entirely. Chunks of ochre, a natural iron-rich pigment, one engraved deliberately with a cross-hatch pattern of lines, dated to around 73,000 years ago, and what appears to be an actual ochre processing station, essentially an ancient paint workshop, roughly 100,000 years old. Ochre stains easily, deeply, and does not wash out in a hurry. Applied to skin, hair, or clothing, it turns a person into a walking statement. Visible from a distance, impossible to miss whether the message was status, group identity, mourning, courtship, or something we simply do not have a word for anymore. None of this is subtle. A pierced shell worn at the throat and a stripe of red ochre across the cheekbones are both, in essence, the same move. Broadcasting something about yourself to everyone else in the group before you have said a single word. That broadcast almost certainly mattered for more than vanity alone. Anthropologists studying ornament and pigment use across cultures consistently link it to status, to marking a skilled hunter, a respected elder, an eligible partner, or simply membership in one specific group rather than another. Which means being watched, judged, and ranked by your own community, the exact pressure so many people describe feeling today. Walking into a room, getting dressed for an occasion, wondering what a stranger's glance actually means, is not a modern invention. It is at minimum 75,000 years old, and quite possibly a great deal older. Somewhere in a group wearing shells and ochre, a hierarchy was quietly forming. Who had earned the right to certain markings? Who had not? Who other people wanted to sit beside at the fire, and who they did not? None of it written down. All of it almost certainly deeply personally felt. But identity performed for an audience is only half the story of what this species was capable of by now. In certain caves, at certain times, some of them were also creating things meant for no audience at all, work carried out in total darkness, far from anyone who would ever praise it, mock it, or even see it. More than 300 meters into Breniquel Cave in southern France, far past any daylight, far past anywhere a person could stumble by accident, someone arranged broken pieces of stalagmite into two rough, circular structures on the cave floor. In 2016, a team led by researcher Jacques Jaubert used uranium series dating to place these structures at roughly 176,000 years old. That number stopped everyone in the field cold, because Homo sapiens had not yet arrived in Europe. The only builders it could have been were Neanderthals. Traces of burnt bone found near the structures suggest fire was carried that deep underground purely to provide light, which means this was not a chance encounter or a place anyone lived. Nobody eats, sleeps, or shelters routinely 300 meters into pitch darkness. Someone went there on purpose, carrying flame, to build something specific. Nobody can say for certain what it meant. A gathering space. A marker of some belief we no longer have any language for. What the structure proves, regardless of the guesswork, is that a Neanderthal mind was capable of organizing a group, a plan, and a considerable physical risk around a goal with no food, safety, or material reward attached to it whatsoever. Researchers estimate that simply lighting and maintaining the area during construction would have required roughly 1 hour of sustained torch and fire management, likely involving several people at once, some tending flame, others carrying and arranging the heavy stalagmite pieces in the dark. That is a coordinated project, not a solitary wander gone strange. Neanderthals left other symbolic traces too. At Krapina, in Croatia, researcher Dvorka Radovsik identified a set of white-tailed eagle talons dated to roughly 130,000 years ago, deliberately notched and polished in ways consistent with them being strung together and worn, likely as jewelry, long before Homo sapiens ever set foot in Europe. And in 2018, researcher Dirk Hoffman and his team used uranium-thorium dating on red pigment paintings found in 3 separate Spanish caves, La Paisiega, Maltreviso, and Ardales, and return an age of at least 64,000 years for some of the markings. Homo sapiens had not yet reached that part of Europe. The painters could only have been Neanderthals. Hand stencils, geometric shapes, lines that appear to trace natural contours in the rock itself, as if the artist were completing something the cave had already half suggested. None of it feeds anyone. None of it fights off a single predator. All of it took real time, in the dark for a purpose that clearly mattered enough to justify that cost. Taken together, the eagle talons, the underground stone rings, and the painted caves dismantle one of the last comfortable assumptions people still hold about Neanderthals, specifically the idea that symbolic thought, art, and ritual belonged to Homo sapiens alone. It clearly did not. Not everyone accepted the Spanish cave dates quietly. Several researchers, including paleoanthropologist Maria Martinon Torres, raised methodological concerns about the uranium-thorium dating technique used, noting that mineral crust can form unevenly and potentially distort an age estimate. The debate remains genuinely open within the field, exactly the kind of honest disagreement good science is supposed to produce. At a site called Regardou, also in France, archaeologists found a Neanderthal burial positioned alongside cave bear remains, and early researchers ran with an elaborate theory about a widespread cave bear cult. Later, more careful analysis found the association was likely coincidental, a caution worth remembering every time this documentary reaches for a tidy explanation of ancient behavior. That caution matters, but it does not erase the genuinely strong evidence sitting elsewhere in this chapter. A Piers Talon in a cave, painting dated through multiple independent methods, are simply a different category of claim than a single burial next to an animal skeleton that could easily have wandered into that same spot on its own. Modern researchers studying the psychology of extended time in total darkness, deep inside real cave systems, report vivid disorientation, altered time perception, and in some cases genuine hallucination after long enough exposure. A journey 300 meters into that same absolute blackness would have been, at minimum, a profoundly altered state of consciousness, whatever the builders of Bruniquel intended by it. Some researchers have floated the idea that these deep, difficult cave journeys may have functioned as a kind of ordeal or rite of passage, testing courage and commitment in young members of the group, not unlike vision quests and initiation trials documented across many recent human cultures, a possibility that fits the effort involved even if it cannot be proven outright. Whatever the precise purpose, walking that far into the dark, on purpose, carrying fire that could fail at any moment, required a species already comfortable holding meaning in a space where none of the ordinary daylight rules, food, safety, status, applied at all. Try to imagine the walk back out afterward, torches guttering low, everyone silently grateful for the first hint of gray light at the cave mouth. Whatever had happened in that stone circle stayed behind them in the dark, and daylight, however harsh and demanding it remained, must have felt, for a moment, like a genuine relief. That contrast, the deliberate discomfort of the ritual space against the ordinary comfort of daylight, may be exactly the point. A society does not typically build meaning around something easy. It builds meaning around something that costs real effort, real risk, and real nerve to attempt at all. Whatever belief carried these particular Neanderthals 300 meters into the earth, it was strong enough to be worth the climb, worth the torches, worth the very real danger of getting lost or losing the flame entirely in a place no rescue party was ever coming to reach. That same capacity for deep, private conviction would soon be tested against a species this documentary has not yet fully introduced, a close cousin sharing the same landscapes, the same fires, and eventually the same beds whose story ends in a way that still shapes the genes of most people alive today. Before that cousin story can be told properly, it helps to remember exactly how much care already existed inside these communities by this point. The toothless elder, the one-eyed hunter, the sick young woman kept alive through weeks of pain, all of it evidence of a species that had already learned to fight for its own long before it ever met a rival closely resembling itself. It is worth remembering, too, that every ritual and every painted wall covered in this chapter was built by hands that also knapped stone, hunted large animals, and buried their own dead with visible tenderness. Symbolism did not arrive as a separate, later upgrade. It grew directly out of everything this documentary has already shown you. The continuity matters more than it might first seem. A species this capable of holding complicated, layered meaning inside a single dark chamber was also fully capable of holding complicated, layered feeling toward a stranger who looked almost but not quite like themselves, walking into their valley from somewhere else entirely. Which makes the next turn in this story land even harder. A species this capable of tenderness, symbolism, and quiet devotion to its own dead was, within a comparatively short span of time, going to be tested by conditions severe enough to strip almost all of that softness away. Around a broadly similar span of deep time, a different kind of ceremony was taking shape elsewhere, this time around the dead rather than the dark. At Kafsa Cave in what is now Israel, researchers uncovered early Homo sapiens burials dated to roughly 100,000 years ago, bodies placed deliberately in pits, some accompanied by red ochre and by objects that appear to be grave offerings. One burial at Kafsa held a child, its arms arranged carefully, with deer antlers placed directly against the body. Nobody buries a child with antlers pressed into their arms by accident. That is a decision made by grieving people meant to say something about that particular life or about wherever they believed it was going next. Compare that against the earlier chapters of this film. The murdered skull at the bottom of a Spanish shaft. The elephant carcass stripped bare in minutes against the clock. The desperate calorie math of an animal that could be eaten or could do the eating. None of that prepares you for a species also capable of laying a child down gently, arranging antlers against small arms, and covering the body with care. This was, by any honest measure, a hidden layer of the human day that had nothing to do with staying alive. Hours spent building something no predator would ever threaten and no hunger would ever be satisfied by. Hours spent grieving in a structured, repeatable way rather than simply walking away from a body and continuing on. It is tempting to read all of this as proof that these people were, underneath everything, fundamentally gentle. That temptation should be resisted. The same capacity for symbolism, structure, and shared belief that built a quiet circle of stone in the dark, or laid a child to rest with care, is also, given enough pressure, capable of justifying almost anything at all. And pressure, real, sustained, world-altering pressure, was coming. Not from a rival group, not from a single bat hunt, from the sky itself, and the slow, relentless cooling of the entire planet these people called home. For roughly 100,000 years, at least 3 distinct kinds of humans shared the same planet at the same time. Homo sapiens in Africa and eventually beyond it, Neanderthals across Europe and Western Asia, and a mysterious third population known mainly from a handful of bones in Siberia called Denisovans. In 2010, geneticist Svana Pabo's team completed a working draft of the Neanderthal genome, and the result reshaped the entire field overnight. Most people alive today with ancestry outside Africa carry somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA quietly present in their own cells right now. That work eventually earned Pabo the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022, a rare instance of ancient bones, some barely larger than a fingertip, leading directly to one of science's highest honors, awarded for essentially founding an entire field capable of reading the genetic diary of species that no longer exist. A skull found in the Czech Republic and cataloged as Zlatikouen yielded, when sequenced, the oldest complete modern human genome recovered to date, and it carried unusually long, unbroken stretches of Neanderthal DNA, the kind of segment that has not yet been broken up by generations of further mixing. This individual's own great-grandparents, in effect, had personally known Neanderthals. The inherited picture is not evenly spread across the whole genome, either. Geneticists David Reich and Sriram Sankaraman identified so-called introgression deserts, large stretches of modern human DNA, especially around the X chromosome and genes tied to fertility. where Neanderthal ancestry is almost completely absent, a likely sign that some hybrid offspring faced reduced fertility or other biological costs. That detail complicates the warm, simple version of this story. These populations were close enough to have children together, and, at the same time, biologically distant enough that some of those unions apparently came at a real reproductive cost, a genuinely uneasy middle ground between one species and two. Traces of Denisovan ancestry have since turned up, faintly, even in some African populations who should, in theory, have had no direct contact with Siberian Denisovans at all, hinting at additional, still poorly understood interbreeding events with other now extinct human relatives that current science has not fully mapped. One of the last confirmed Neanderthal populations anywhere held on inside Gorham's Cave, on the coast of Gibraltar, in a landscape isolated enough and rich enough in coastal resources to support a small holdout population after most of the continent's Neanderthals had already vanished, a final, lingering ember of an entire branch of humanity slowly going dark. Try to imagine what the last handful of years actually looked like for a group like that. Still hunting, still tending fire, still very likely telling stories at night, with absolutely no way of knowing they represented nearly the final chapter of an entire lineage stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. There was no dramatic final battle to mark the moment, no last stand anyone could point to afterward, just fewer births than deaths, season after season, until one year the fire at Gorham's Cave simply was not relit, and nobody left alive anywhere else on the planet to notice exactly when. And yet, in a strange, quiet way, they did not fully disappear. A fragment of that lineage is very likely sitting inside your own genome right now, reading this sentence through eyes shaped, in some small measure, by people who once kept a fire burning on the edge of a cliff at the very end of the world they knew. Survival, in the end, was never only a matter of individual toughness or a single clever trick. It increasingly depended on something this documentary has been quietly building toward for several chapters now. A mind capable of holding on to more than it had personally lived through, passed from one head into another, faster than biology alone could ever manage. It is worth pausing on the strange, emotional weight of all this. Two populations close enough to fall in love, close enough to raise children together, and still, within a few thousand years, one of them gone completely, leaving the other to wonder quietly, forever, exactly what was lost along with them. Nobody living through those final overlapping centuries could have known they were witnessing an ending. It would have looked, from the inside, like an ordinary run of hard seasons, one valley quieter than it used to be, one familiar face from a neighboring group simply not showing up to trade the following year. That is not the genetic signature of two species that only ever fought on sight. That percentage requires actual reproduction, repeated across enough encounters, in enough different places to leave a permanent mark on an entire lineage tens of thousands of years later. In Denisova Cave, the same cave that gave the Denisovans their name, researchers examined a small bone fragment belonging to a girl who died around 90,000 years ago, and her genome delivered a genuine shock. Her mother was Neanderthal. Her father was Denisovan. She was a first-generation child of two different human lineages meeting directly, in person, in that exact cave. Researchers nicknamed her Denny. She is, to date, the single most direct physical proof we have that these were not separate, hostile species passing each other at a distance. They were close enough, often enough for a mother and a father from two different kinds of human to have a child together, and for that child to be born and to be found. Genetic modeling places the main window of interbreeding between Neanderthals and the ancestors of non-African Homo sapiens somewhere around 50 to 60,000 years ago. Most likely in the Middle East, the geographic doorway, any population leaving Africa would have had to pass through on the way to everywhere else. Some of that inherited Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA turn out to be genuinely useful. Researchers found that a gene called EPS1, inherited from Denisovans, helps modern Tibetan populations handle the thin oxygen of high altitude far better than most other humans on the planet, a direct, functional gift passed down from an extinct population into people alive today. Other inherited fragments carry a harder edge. Researchers analyzing large genetic databases have linked certain surviving Neanderthal gene variants to differences in blood clotting, skin sensitivity to sun, and more surprisingly, a measurable association with mood-related traits in some populations today, an ancient hand still lightly resting on a fairly private part of modern life. Genome sequencing of Neanderthal remains from Siberia's Altai region also revealed something quietly sad on its own terms: evidence of long-term inbreeding within small, isolated Neanderthal groups, family trees folding back on themselves generation after generation in a way that erodes genetic health over time. That detail adds a quieter, less dramatic explanation to the extinction question sitting alongside climate pressure and resource competition. A population already small, already fragmented, already losing genetic diversity through repeated inbreeding is a population with far less resilience left in reserve when a true crisis eventually arrives. Homo sapiens, spreading across a much larger and more interconnected range, appears to have maintained a broader, healthier gene pool by comparison, which may have mattered every bit as much as any single advantage in tools, language, or cunning when the climate genuinely turned hostile for everyone at once. A skeleton found in Romania, cataloged as OACE-1 and dated to roughly 40,000 years ago, tells a similarly intimate story. Genetic analysis found that this man had a Neanderthal ancestor as recently as 4 to 6 generations back in his own family line. Not a distant relative from deep history, a great-great-grandparent, essentially. And yet, somewhere around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals as a distinct population disappear from the fossil record entirely. Denisovans fade from direct evidence around a similar era. Only Homo sapiens walks out the other side of that bottleneck as a continuing, expanding population. Nobody has a single clean answer for why. Shifting climate placed enormous pressure on smaller Neanderthal populations already spread thin across harsh terrain. Direct competition for the same limited game and shelter likely made a hard situation worse. Some researchers point to disease crossing between the two closely related populations as another possible factor. What almost nobody argues anymore is the older, simpler version, one clever species arriving and simply wiping out a dumber one in open conflict. The genetic evidence sitting inside billions of living people today tells a messier, more human story. Not just conquest, also closeness, attraction, and children born from it, right up until one side of that family tree quietly stopped continuing. Which leaves an uncomfortable inheritance sitting inside almost every non-African person alive right now. A small percentage of your own genome came from people your ancestors also, in some measure, outcompete, outlasted, and ultimately replaced. Grief and survival, tangled together in your own cells, whether you ever asked for either one. So what actually gave Homo sapiens the edge, if it was not brute force and it was not some enormous gap in raw intelligence? The honest answer starts, again, around a fire in the dark, with something happening between people that had nothing to do with hunting or tool-making at all. A warning cry works exactly once. Say leopard, everyone scatters, and the information is used up the moment it is heard. A story does something a warning cry can never do. It can describe a leopard attack that happened to someone else years ago, somewhere else entirely, and still change how a listener behaves the very next morning. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar has argued that human language may have evolved, in part, as a replacement for something apes spend enormous amounts of their day doing instead. Physical grooming, picking through fur one-on-one to build and maintain social bonds. Grooming does not scale. You cannot groom 50 people before lunch. Talking does scale. A single conversation around a fire can update, reassure, or warn an entire group at once, which means language let human social groups grow far larger than grooming alone could ever have supported, without anyone needing more hours in the day to manage it. Dunbar tied this directly to brain structure, proposing what is now called the social brain hypothesis, the idea that the size of a primate's neocortex predicts, with real accuracy, the maximum number of stable social relationships that species can typically maintain. For humans, that number lands somewhere around 150, a figure still cited constantly across sociology and business research today. Anthropologist Michael Tomasello has argued that something even more specific separates human cognition from that of our closest primate relatives, an ability called shared intentionality, the capacity for two or more minds to jointly focus on the same goal, understanding that the other party understands it too. A chimpanzee can want something. Humans can want something together, consciously, as a team. Shared intentionality is exactly what a myth or a shared belief actually requires. Not just one person imagining a story, but an entire group agreeing together that the story matters, that it carries real weight, and that everyone present should act as though it is true, together at the same time. That same imaginative leap, holding something that does not physically exist clearly enough in the mind to plan around it, also unlocks something researchers call counterfactual thinking. What if the herd moves north instead of south this season? What if that ridge floods again the way the old story said it once did? Reasoning about possibilities that have not happened yet, based on possibilities that supposedly happened long before you were born. Historian Yuval Noah Harari has popularized the term cognitive revolution for this general shift, arguing that the ability to believe collectively in things that exist only as shared ideas, rules, spirits, tribal identities, eventually allowed much larger numbers of unrelated humans to cooperate than any grooming-based primate troop ever could. None of this required writing, mathematics, or anything resembling formal record-keeping. It required only a voice, a listener, enough trust between them to take the story seriously, and enough repetition across enough evenings for the story to survive being passed from one mind into another, and then one more. Michael Tomasello describes the resulting pattern as a cultural ratchet, the idea that once a piece of knowledge is taught faithfully enough, generation after generation, it rarely slips backward again. Improvements accumulate instead of resetting, each new generation starting from where the last one finished, rather than relearning everything painfully from raw instinct alone. Researchers testing this directly, running the same simple task through chains of human children passing instructions to each other, found steady, measurable improvement across each new link in the chain. Running the identical experiment with chimpanzees produced no such climb. Knowledge passed along, but it did not noticeably build on itself the way it does in even very young humans. That single difference, small on paper, compounds into something enormous across enough generations. A species that merely repeats what it is taught stays roughly where it started. A species that improves slightly with every retelling ends up somewhere entirely different 1,000 generations later, without any single storyteller ever intending the larger outcome. A second real-world example only strengthens the earlier Aboriginal Australian case. Oral traditions among the Klamath people of Oregon describe a catastrophic mountain collapsing in fire and darkness, a story researchers have connected to the actual eruption of Mount Mazama roughly 7,700 years ago, an event that carved out what is now known as Crater Lake. Two entirely unrelated cultures on opposite sides of the planet, each managed to preserve accurate memory of a real, specific, catastrophic event across thousands of years using nothing but spoken word. That is not folklore dismissed lightly. That is a functioning information storage system, older than any library ever built. Stories were never only about floods, eruptions, and dangerous animals, either. The same evenings almost certainly carried rules. Who shares food with whom? What happens to someone who breaks trust with a group? Which behavior earns respect and which earns quiet, lasting shame? Myth was doing double duty, holding practical knowledge in one hand and the entire social contract in the other. Picture a child hearing the same cautionary story for the third or fourth time, already knowing exactly how it ends, and still leaning in closer anyway. That repetition was not wasted effort. It was rehearsal, quietly wiring a lesson deep enough into memory that it would surface instantly, without conscious thought, the moment real danger or real temptation actually arrived. That is, in the end, what a healthy memory looks like in any group, human or otherwise. Not simply facts stored away, but facts turned into instinct, ready to fire the instant they are needed, carried forward by people who may never fully understand why they suddenly feel afraid of a particular ridge or a particular silence, only that they do. A species with that kind of compounding memory had built something genuinely new under the sun, an inheritance that had nothing to do with genes at all, passed hand to hand, voice to voice, evening after evening, gathering weight with every single retelling. That inheritance was about to be tested in a way no story had ever prepared anyone for. Every skill, every bond, every quiet act of memory this documentary has spent 15 chapters describing was still, underneath it all, dependent on a world that behaved with at least some rough consistency. That consistency was about to disappear. No story passed down at any fire could have described what was coming, because nothing like it had ever happened within living memory or the memory of the memory before that. This was new in the oldest and coldest sense of that word, and no accumulated wisdom on earth could fully prepare a person for it. And yet the very same capacity for memory and story that could not predict this specific disaster would turn out to matter enormously in surviving it, holding groups together, coordinating strangers, carrying warnings and lessons fast enough to outpace a crisis that was moving faster than anything the species had ever faced before. Somewhere in the stretch of time between roughly 70 and 50,000 years ago, alongside the ornament, ochre, and burial evidence already covered in this film, something else appears to shift as well. Symbolic thought becomes richer, planning becomes more abstract, and the tools and art being produced grow noticeably more varied and inventive across different regions at once. Researchers sometimes call this shift behavioral modernity, and its causes are still debated. What is not seriously in dispute is the result. A mind that could now hold an imagined scenario in its head clearly enough to describe it to someone else, and have that other person picture it too, well enough to plan around it. That is not a small trick. A hunter who has never personally seen a river flood can still avoid camping near it, purely because an elder once described watching it happen. A child who has never faced a specific predator can still recognize the danger instantly, purely from a story told at the right moment, years before the danger ever actually arrives. There is a striking, much later example of exactly this kind of memory holding real information across almost impossible spans of time. Researchers Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed studied Aboriginal Australian oral traditions describing coastlines that no longer exist and found the stories accurately preserved details about sea levels rising after the last ice age, events that occurred more than 7,000 years earlier. 7,000 years, carried forward by voice alone, no writing involved at any point, and the core facts still held. If a spoken story could survive that intact for that long, it becomes a great deal easier to imagine what oral tradition was capable of preserving much earlier, when it was still one of the only technologies a group had for holding on to anything at all. Once knowledge could compound like that, passed down, refined, added to by each new generation instead of relearned painfully from nothing every single time, an entirely new kind of advantage entered the human toolkit. Not a sharper stone, not a stronger arm, a group memory, longer than any single lifetime, quietly accumulating in the background of every ordinary evening around the fire. That accumulating memory would matter more than anyone gathered around those fires could possibly have known, because the climate holding their entire world together was already beginning, slowly, and then not slowly at all, to change. It did not arrive as a single storm or a single terrible winter. It arrived the way most true catastrophes do, slowly enough that people kept adjusting, kept coping, kept telling themselves it would turn around, right up until it became undeniable that it would not. Climate scientists call this stretch the last glacial maximum, generally dated from around 26,500 years ago to roughly 19,000 years ago, with conditions at their harshest close to the middle of that window. Ice sheets, in places, sat over 2 kilometers thick across huge stretches of North America and Northern Europe. So much of the planet's water became locked into that ice that global sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters. Coastlines that groups had foraged and fished along for generations simply stopped existing, retreating far out of reach, taking entire familiar landscapes with them. Global average temperatures during the coldest stretch of this period sat roughly 6 degrees Celsius below where they stand today, a number that sounds modest until you remember that a shift of even 1 or 2 degrees is enough to reorganize which plants grow, which animals can survive a given range, and which rivers freeze solid for months at a time. Vast stretches of northern Europe and North America became functionally uninhabitable, buried under ice, or turned into frozen, wind-scoured tundra with almost nothing growing. Human populations did not spread evenly across this new world. They contracted hard into a small number of relatively survivable pockets researchers now call glacial refugia. The Iberian Peninsula, parts of Italy, and the Balkans became exactly this kind of refuge, warmer, less exposed, holding on to enough vegetation and game to support life, while the land further north became a frozen dead zone. Archaeological sites cluster noticeably thicker in these regions during the coldest centuries, a visible record of people retreating toward whatever warmth remained. Not every group simply endured passively. In parts of France and Spain, the Solutrean culture developed genuinely inventive new technology under this same pressure. Delicate, leaf-shaped stone points worked thinner and sharper than almost anything that came before, alongside some of the earliest dyed needles, suggesting fitted, sewn clothing built specifically to survive brutal cold. Bone chemistry from human remains in this period tells its own quiet story of hardship. Nitrogen isotope spikes, the kind that show up when a starving body begins breaking down its own muscle tissue for fuel, appear in several skeletons from across this window, a chemical signature of genuine, sustained hunger written directly into collagen. Sewn clothing, refuge regions, sharper weapons, none of it made the crisis survivable for everyone. It simply changed who got a chance to keep struggling, and for how long before the deeper, harder choices covered in the next part of this film became the only choices still left on the table. The cold did not settle in smoothly, either. Climate researchers have identified a series of abrupt cooling pulses within this broader era, sometimes called Heinrich events, tied to massive discharges of icebergs breaking off into the North Atlantic. Each pulse could plunge regional temperatures down sharply within a single human generation, undoing decades of hard-won adaptation almost overnight. That kind of whiplash, warming just enough to encourage resettlement, then collapsing again without warning, is arguably crueler than a steady, predictable decline. It punished exactly the kind of long-term planning and memory this documentary has spent so many chapters celebrating, rewarding caution one generation and then abandoning it entirely the next. Genetic studies analyzing mitochondrial diversity across modern human populations suggest a marked narrowing during this general period, consistent with global population numbers dropping substantially below what they had been in warmer centuries, a demographic near-miss written permanently into the DNA of everyone descended from the survivors. Megafauna felt the same pressure. Woolly mammoth and cave lion populations across Eurasia began contracting hard during this same window. The first visible tremors of a wave of large animal extinctions that would eventually remove many of the very species human hunting strategies have been built around for hundreds of thousands of years. Skeletal remains of children from this era frequently show something called Harris lines, faint bands visible in long bone growth plates that mark periods where normal growth simply stopped for a stretch, the body diverting every available resource toward bare survival instead of toward getting any bigger. Every one of these signals, the iceberg pulses, the shrinking gene pool, the vanishing megafauna, the arrested growth in a child's own bones, points toward the same unavoidable conclusion. This was not a difficult season that would simply pass. This was the ground itself withdrawing the terms the entire human story had always assumed it could count on. Picture a mother during one of these winters, rationing the last dried strips of meat between her own children, doing the arithmetic every parent dreads: who eats today, who waits until tomorrow, and whether tomorrow's portion will exist at all by the time it actually arrives. That kind of arithmetic does not stay contained to one bad week. Repeated often enough, across enough winters, it starts to reshape what a group considers acceptable, what it considers necessary, and eventually, for some groups in some places, what it considers survivable at any cost at all. Every skill, every bond, every quiet act of devotion covered across the 15 chapters leading up to this one was about to be tested against exactly the kind of arithmetic run over and over in valley after valley, until something in the old rhythm of daily life finally, unmistakably broke. It would be comforting to imagine every group responded to that breaking point the exact same way. They did not. Facing the identical cold, the identical hunger, and the identical uncertainty, different communities in different valleys arrived at profoundly different answers to the same impossible question. Answers this documentary now has to look at directly without flinching. There is no way to soften what is coming, and this documentary is not going to try. What follows is the honest, uncomfortable center of the entire human story, the moment every skill, every bond, and every quiet act of devotion covered so far gets weighed against a hunger that does not negotiate. Some groups facing this exact pressure held together. Others did not. The difference between the two often came down to factors no individual could control: the specific valley they happened to occupy, the specific herd migration that happened to fail, the sheer indifferent luck of geography during a crisis that cared nothing for fairness. Everything covered so far in this documentary, the long walks, the butchery, the careful foraging routes passed down as memory from elder to child, assumed a world that behaved with at least some consistency. That consistency was now gone, replaced by shorter growing seasons, thinner herds, and winters that stretched further into what used to be reliable spring. Genetic studies of human populations from this era point to sharp bottlenecks, moments where the number of people successfully surviving and reproducing dropped steeply, leaving a visible dip in the genetic diversity of the descendants who came after. Entire regional populations appear to have shrunk drastically or vanished from the record altogether. Archaeologists have found sites from this period abandoned in ways that feel less like a planned departure and more like a group simply giving up mid-task. Tools left where they were dropped, meals left unfinished, the kind of evidence that suggests people left in a hurry or stopped coming back at all. Skeletal remains from this window tell their own quiet, grim story. Enamel hypoplasia, faint horizontal grooves in tooth enamel that form during periods of serious childhood malnutrition or illness, shows up with striking frequency in remains from this era, a permanent record of hunger written directly into the body before death. At sites like Dolny Vestinus in the modern Czech Republic, communities of the Gravettian culture had built an entire way of life around hunting mammoth herds across the open steppe, an extraordinary, highly organized strategy for its time. As the climate worsened and those herds thinned and scattered, that same specialized strategy became a liability instead of an advantage. Every advantage this species had spent nearly 2 million years accumulating: fire, tools, language, memory, care for the injured, cooperation across a group, was suddenly being tested against a version of scarcity that made the earlier chapters of this film look almost gentle by comparison. Because scarcity, real, sustained, world-altering scarcity, does not just make people hungrier. It changes what people are willing to consider. It changes what a family is, what a stranger is, what counts as unthinkable, and what quietly stops being unthinkable at all, once every other option has already run out. That is where this story is going next, and it does not soften the landing. Some of what the archaeological record shows from inside this crisis is genuinely difficult to sit with. It is also, without question, the truth of what happened when an entire world simply stopped providing enough. In Gough's Cave, in Cheddar Gorge, England, human bones dated to roughly 14,700 years ago carry cut marks in the same locations, made with the same techniques that Ice Age hunters used on deer and horse. Long bones had been deliberately broken open. The marrow inside had been extracted and, in all likelihood, eaten. Researcher Sylvia Bello and colleagues at the Natural History Museum in London went further, identifying skull fragments carefully shaped into what appear to be drinking cups. The bone worked and smoothed with the same patient practice skill applied everywhere else in this film to stone and antler. In Spain, at a site called El Sidrón, a Neanderthal group living roughly 49,000 years ago left behind bones showing an almost identical pattern. Cut marks consistent with defleshing, fractures consistent with marrow extraction. 12 individuals, an entire family group by some estimates, processed with the same tools they had likely used in better years on animals. Archaeologists are careful, and rightly so, not to reduce every one of these sites down to one single motive. Some researchers argue certain cases lean closer to ritual practice, a way of processing the dead tide to belief rather than hunger. Others point to timing, location, and the sheer desperation of the surrounding climate, and lean towards simple, brutal survival. The pattern reaches back further than the Ice Age, too. At Grandolina, part of the same Atapuerca complex introduced at the very start of this film, researcher Udall Carbonell identified cut-marked human remains belonging to Homo antecessor, dated to roughly 800,000 years ago, processed with the same butchery technique used on deer found in the identical layer. Carbonell proposed that this specific case may have functioned less as a response to hunger and more as a way of dealing with outsiders, competitors from a rival group treated, brutally, as simply another resource. If accurate, it means this behavior did not wait for the Ice Age to appear. It was already sitting somewhere in the toolkit far earlier than anyone once wanted to believe. Taphonomists, researchers who study exactly how bones come to look the way they do after death, are quick to point out a real limitation here, sometimes called the equifinality problem. Multiple, very different original events, ritual defleshing, opportunistic scavenging, deliberate violence, can leave remarkably similar marks on old bone, which makes absolute certainty about motive genuinely difficult to reach. It is worth remembering, too, that not every documented instance of eating human remains has been driven by hunger at all, even in far more recent history. Among the 4 people of Papua New Guinea, anthropologists recorded a funerary practice in which relatives consumed parts of the deceased specifically as an act of grief and respect, a final, intimate way of keeping a loved one close rather than a symptom of famine. That practice came at a devastating cost. It spread a fatal brain disease called Kuru through the community, a tragic reminder that even an act rooted entirely in love and mourning can carry consequences nobody involved could have possibly foreseen or wanted. So the honest picture across all of these sites, Gough's Cave, El Sidrón, Grandolina, and beyond, is not a single simple story about starving people doing one unthinkable thing. It is several different stories, driven by hunger in some cases, by belief in others, by conflict in others still, all leaving disturbingly similar traces on bone, and all demanding the same uncomfortable respect for how little any one explanation covers. Researchers distinguish these cases from natural decay using a specific checklist. Cut marks positioned exactly where muscle attaches to bone, matching known butchery patterns. Percussion marks and impact scars consistent with cracking a bone open specifically for marrow. Human tooth marks of a size and spacing that rules out any scavenging animal. When several of these signs appear together on the same bone, the conclusion becomes very difficult to avoid. It is worth understanding just how poor a calorie source another human body actually is compared to the effort and danger involved in obtaining it. Anthropologists calculating the caloric return of human tissue against the risk, both physical and social, of acquiring it consistently find the math unfavorable, which strongly suggests this was never a first resort, chosen casually while easier options remained available. That single calculation matters enormously for how this evidence should be read. A choice this costly, this poor in simple nutritional terms, only starts to make sense once every other option, the long walk turning up nothing, the butchery skills with no carcass to use them on, has already been thoroughly exhausted first. Some researchers studying Gough's cave specifically have noted the sheer technical skill on display. The same practice precision applied to red deer and horse remains found in the identical layer, applied here without hesitation, without any visible change in method between one kind of body and another. That consistency of skill is, in its own quiet way, the most unsettling detail in the entire chapter. Not frenzy, not chaos. The same steady, practiced hand this documentary has followed since the very first Acheulean hand axe, doing exactly what it had always been trained to do, turn toward the one kind of body it was never supposed to have to. This chapter has not tried to soften that, and it will not try to explain it away in the next one either. What comes next is not a rebuttal or correction. It is simply the other half of the exact same crisis, playing out at the same time, a few valleys or a few centuries removed, among people facing the identical collapsing world. It would be easy to close this chapter by insisting these people were somehow separate from us, an isolated, unlucky branch of humanity pushed to an extreme none of the rest of us would ever face. The uncomfortable truth is that nothing about their biology, their intelligence, or their capacity for love was any different from what is sitting in this room with you right now. What was different was the world pressing in on them, a specific, unbearable set of circumstances that stripped away every option this documentary has spent 16 chapters describing, until one option, the worst one, was simply the only one still standing. Hold on to that discomfort rather than resolving it. It is doing exactly the job it should be doing, reminding you that the line between an ordinary, decent life and something unthinkable is not nearly as thick or as far away as most of us would prefer to believe. It is tempting, reading all of this from a warm room with a full pantry nearby, to feel a quiet, comfortable certainty that you would have chosen differently. That certainty is worth distrusting. Nobody who ever faced this choice believed, the week before, that they were capable of it either. There is a reason researchers approach sites like this with visible discomfort of their own, choosing words carefully in published papers, avoiding sensational language even when the underlying evidence is genuinely disturbing. Respect for the people involved does not disappear simply because those people have been dead for thousands of years. Carry that discomfort forward rather than setting it down, because the next chapter is going to ask you to hold it next to something else entirely, proof that under the exact same impossible pressure, other people, just as hungry, just as frightened, chose an entirely different way through. What the evidence does not support is easy dismissal. This happened more than once, across more than one human population, separated by tens of thousands of years and hundreds of miles, in eras when food had become desperately, dangerously scarce for reasons entirely outside anyone's control. Try, for a moment, to sit inside that decision rather than simply recoiling from it. A group that has already exhausted every option covered earlier in this film. The long walk, further than ever, turning up nothing. The butchery skills, useless, because there is no carcass left anywhere for miles to actually butcher. The fire's still burning because fire at least is free, but with nothing left to cook over it. Children, if there were children, growing weaker by the day, in bodies that a full winter of genuine famine can break down with frightening speed. This is not a chapter that offers comfort, and it should not pretend to. The same intelligence that carved a symmetrical hand axe, the same coordination that stripped an elephant carcass in minutes, the same steady hand that fed a toothless elder for years, all of it was still present in the people who made these particular cuts. Nothing about them had stopped being human. That is precisely what makes it unbearable. It would be far more comfortable to believe this only happened to some other kind of person, someone fundamentally different from us, acting from a cruelty we could never share. The evidence does not allow for that comfort. It shows ordinary toolmakers, ordinary parents, ordinary members of a community pushed to a place none of us can honestly claim we would never reach. There is no tidy lesson to close this chapter with, and reaching for one would insult what actually happened at Goff's Cave in El Sidron. There is only the fact of it, sitting in the bone record, waiting a very long time for someone to look closely enough to understand exactly what they were looking at. At the Sungur site in Russia, roughly 34,000 years ago, in the depths of a brutal ice age, someone buried 2 children laid head to head, their bodies covered in an almost unimaginable amount of mammoth ivory beads. Later estimates put the total count at somewhere around 10,000. Researchers estimate that a single ivory bead, carved and polished by hand, took roughly an hour of steady, skilled labor to produce. 10,000 beads is not a quick gesture of grief. It is thousands of hours of a community's collective time poured into honoring 2 young lives during the exact same climate crisis that was starving people elsewhere into unthinkable choices. That kind of investment does not happen inside a group that is turned entirely inward and hostile. It happens inside a group with enough surplus trust, enough shared belief in what the effort meant, to spend that much collective time on something with no direct nutritional return at all. Archaeologists studying raw materials from this same broad era found something equally telling. Shell ornaments and worked obsidian at various Upper Paleolithic sites have been carried, hand to hand, across distances sometimes exceeding 200 or 300 kilometers, far beyond what any single group's own territory could explain. At Kostenki, in Russia, archaeologists found marine shells originating from the Black Sea, hundreds of kilometers from the site itself, alongside fossil shells carried an even greater distance from the Mediterranean. Somebody, or more likely a whole chain of somebodies, moved these objects hand to hand across an enormous stretch of frozen continent. At Dolny Vestinus, the same site struggling under mammoth herd collapse covered in the previous chapter, archaeologists also found small fired clay figurines, including a well-known animal figure often called the Dolny Vestinus Venus, dated to roughly 26,000 years ago, among the oldest ceramic objects ever produced anywhere by anyone. Firing clay requires a kiln, sustained heat, and real technical knowledge. Effort spent on symbolic, fragile art objects at the exact same site, in the exact same hard era, where hunger was pressing in from every direction. That kind of investment does not happen in a community that has abandoned everything except raw survival. Further west, at a site called Mazyrik in Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered dwellings built almost entirely from mammoth bones. Dozens of skulls, tusks, and jaws stacked and arranged with clear structural intent, representing the pooled remains of many separate hunts, gathered and shared across what was very likely more than one single family group. A structure like that argues for something researchers call an aggregation site, a location where multiple smaller bands gathered periodically, pooling resources, skills, and labor for a shared purpose no single small family could manage alone, then dispersing again once the immediate need or occasion had passed. A modern parallel helps make the logic concrete. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner documented a formal gift exchange system among the Juhoansi San called Hexero, in which individuals maintain long-distance partnerships built on reciprocal generosity, explicitly functioning as insurance, so that when your own area fails, a distant partner's surplus becomes something you can draw on instead. If Ice Age humans were running some early version of that same logic, and the shells, the obsidian, the shared bone lodges all point strongly in that direction, then generosity itself was not simply a nice sentiment layered on top of survival. It was the actual mechanism, quietly doing the work that no single hunter, however skilled, could ever do entirely alone. Researchers Mary Steiner and Stephen Kuhn, comparing material transport distances across different populations of this era, found that some groups maintained noticeably wider exchange networks than others, moving stone, shell, and information across much greater distances, connecting communities that never permanently lived side by side. A network like that is not built in a single generous afternoon. It requires periodic gatherings, likely at agreed locations and times, where separate bands met, exchanged goods, exchanged stories, and very likely exchanged marriage partners as well, weaving multiple small groups into something that could survive a local disaster no single one of them could survive alone. Think about what that actually buys a group during a famine. If your own valley fails, your own herds vanish, your own children start going hungry, a wider network means somewhere out there, a distant group you traded with years ago might still have enough to share, or at minimum, somewhere else to walk toward that is not simply more of the same emptiness. That single structural difference, a narrow, closed circle of trust versus a wide, actively maintained one, may have mattered more to long-term survival through the last glacial maximum than any single tool, any single hunting technique, or any single burst of individual cleverness covered earlier in this film. It is worth sitting for a moment with both of these responses at once, side by side, without picking a side to feel comfortable about. One group, cornered by the same collapsing world, turned inward and did the unthinkable to survive one more season. Another group, facing the identical hunger, spent thousands of hours burying 2 children in beads and kept its doors open to strangers hundreds of miles away. Neither response makes the other one less real or less human. Both came out of the same species, under the same pressure, within the same narrow window of frozen, desperate centuries. That, more than any single artifact in this entire film, may be the truest picture we have of what a person actually is when everything soft about daily life has been stripped completely away. Archaeologist Otto Bader, who led the original Sunger excavations in the 1950s and 60s, found the ivory beads clustered in patterns consistent with having been sewn directly onto fitted clothing and caps, meaning those 10,000 beads were not simply piled on top of 2 bodies. They were worked painstakingly into actual garments, tailored for children who would never grow into them. A third burial at the same site holds an adult male, accompanied by a mammoth ivory lance carved to a length of well over 2 meters, straightened from a single curved tusk through a process requiring heat, moisture, and enormous patience, a technical achievement that stands alongside anything else this documentary has described as skilled craft. Some anthropologists describe wide exchange relationships from this era using a concept called social storage, treating trust and reciprocity built up with distant partners as a kind of bank account, one that earns no visible interest in good years, but can be drawn on directly the moment a group's own local resources fail. Large-scale kill sites from the Solutrean era, showing the remains of dozens of horses driven over the same cliff or into the same natural trap in a single event, point toward cooperation on a scale no single family band could organize alone, multiple groups combining labor, timing, and local knowledge to pull off a hunt of that size. That kind of coordinated, multi-group hunt only works with the same trust already built through gift exchange, shared burial ceremonies, and periodic gathering covered earlier in this chapter. Cooperation was not a separate, occasional event layered on top of ordinary life. It was the connective tissue holding together everything else this species had already built. Trace that thread all the way back to the shared hearth that first split the day in two, the central gathering point where an injured elder was once fed by hands that were not his own, and the line running forward to 10,000 beads sewn onto two small burial garments becomes a single, continuous story, not two separate ones. Picture two children laid down together, side by side, surrounded by more collective labor than most modern families will ever see poured into a single event, in a world where every single calorie spent on beads instead of food was a real, felt sacrifice by everyone who chose to make it anyway. That sacrifice is the whole argument of this chapter in miniature. A community capable of that kind of collective grief, that kind of shared investment in two small lives already lost, was also, unmistakably, a community capable of extending the exact same generosity outward to a hungry stranger arriving from 3 valleys over. Both responses to that same brutal winter, the one covered here and the one covered in the previous chapter, are still sitting somewhere inside every one of us right now, waiting quietly to see which version of the crisis we would become if the world ever asked the same question of us again. Slowly, imperceptibly, the worst of that specific crisis eventually passed. The ice began its long retreat, and the survivors on both sides of that terrible winter, the ones who turned inward and the ones who opened outward, carried what remained of the old forging rhythm into a world that was about to change one final time in a way nothing before it ever had. It is worth asking, honestly, which of these two responses eventually shaped more of what came after. The archaeological record suggests it was generosity, not collapse, that left the deeper mark, wide networks of trust surviving long enough to become the template for everything communities would go on to build once the ice finally let go. None of that generosity was ever purely selfless, either, and it does not need to be to still count. A hungry stranger fed today became a trading partner tomorrow, a source of news the day after, an ally the following winter. Kindness and self-interest were never as far apart in this story as they are often assumed to be. At a site called Ohalo II, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, archaeologists found grinding stones dated to roughly 23,000 years ago, still carrying microscopic starch residue from wild barley and wheat. People were harvesting and processing wild grain seriously and skillfully, long before anyone thought to plant a single seed on purpose. By roughly 12,500 years ago, communities we now call Natufian spread across what is today Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria were doing something genuinely new, building permanent, round stone houses, digging storage pits lined with plaster to keep gathered grain dry, staying, season after season, in the same settled spot. Flint sickle blades from this period still carry a distinctive sheen, a polish caused specifically by repeated contact with the silica in grass stems, direct physical proof of people harvesting wild cereals at real scale, again and again, in the same fields, year after year. At Ain Malaha, also known as Ainan, in northern Israel, Natufian communities built clusters of round stone houses with paved floors and hearths built directly into them. Structures repaired and rebuilt across multiple generations rather than abandoned after a single season, a level of permanence almost nothing earlier in this documentary has shown. A grave at Ain Malaha holds something else worth pausing on, an elderly person buried with a hand resting gently on a puppy, dated to roughly 12,000 years ago. Genetic and archaeological work elsewhere, particularly on a joint burial at Bonn Oberkassel in Germany dated even earlier, around 14,200 years ago, confirms dogs had by now become full domesticated companions, not merely tolerated scavengers at the edge of camp. That relationship marks its own quiet turning point. The first species humans deliberately reshaped through generations of companionship rather than pure utility, sharing warmth, sharing food, sharing the exact transition into settled life that the rest of this chapter is describing. Roughly 1,000 years after the earliest Natufian settlements, at a hilltop site in modern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, people who were still, by every available measure, hunter-gatherers rather than farmers, raised enormous carved stone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, some weighing many tons, decorated with animals in relief. Archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led excavations there for years, proposed something that flips the usual assumption on its head. Rather than agriculture eventually producing enough surplus to support religion and monuments, the enormous labor of feeding workers gathered to build a site like Göbekli Tepe may have been one of the direct pressures that pushed nearby communities toward deliberately cultivating grain in the first place. Whichever direction the pressure actually ran, monument or field first, the two shifts, permanent gathering and permanent farming, arrived within a remarkably tight window of each other, reinforcing one another until neither one was easily reversible anymore. Researchers George Armalagos and Mark Nathan Cohen, comparing skeletal populations across this exact transition, documented a measurable drop in average adult height alongside a sharp rise in dental cavities and parodic hyperostosis, a spongy, telltale bone lesion strongly associated with chronic anemia and nutritional stress in growing children. At Abu Huraira, in modern Syria, archaeologists documented one of the most complete sequences anywhere showing this exact shift in slow motion. The same settlement occupied continuously across the transition. Its plant remains gradually changing from a wide variety of wild seeds toward a narrower, increasingly dominant handful of cultivated grains. Researchers Gordon Hillman and Dorian Fuller studied the physical grain itself for proof of this shift, tracking a specific genetic mutation that stops a ripe seed head from shattering and scattering naturally. Wild plants need that shattering to reproduce. Farm plants do not, since humans do the scattering for them, and the non-shattering version, unintentionally favored by repeated harvesting, spread through cultivated fields over centuries. That single mutation is a domestication event written directly into the genetics of the plant itself, proof that people were not simply gathering wild grain anymore. They were unconsciously breeding it, harvest after harvest, into something that could no longer easily survive without them. Researcher Alison McIntosh compared the arm bones of early Neolithic farming women against those of modern athletes, and found bone strength in these ancient women's upper arms regularly exceeding that of competitive rowing crews today, evidence of repetitive, punishing daily labor, almost certainly grinding grain by hand for hours at a stretch, every single day for years. That detail cuts against any simple story of farming as an easy upgrade from the exhausting uncertainty of foraging. Anthropologist Marshall Solins coined a deliberately provocative phrase for the alternative, calling many foraging societies the original affluent society, pointing to studies of groups like the Hadza who often spend only a handful of hours a day on food-related work. A handful of hours a day spent on food, followed by real, unstructured time left over for rest, socializing, and whatever else a person wanted to do with it, against a farmer's dawn to dusk labor bound to the unyielding schedule of a field. Whatever was gained in this transition, in reliability, in eventual population growth, something real was quietly given up in exchange. Picture the actual texture of that older kind of morning one final time. No fixed field waiting, no single crop demanding attention on its own unforgiving timetable, just a wide, varied landscape and a body still free to decide, largely for itself, where the day's effort would actually go. Set against it, a Natufian morning that increasingly looked like this instead, rising with the sun because the field required it, not because a predator did, bent over the same patch of ground day after day, watching a single crop's fate become, more and more, your own. Nobody chose this trade in one single conscious moment, weighing freedom against security and picking security outright. It arrived the way most of the biggest shifts in this documentary have arrived, gradually, reasonably, one slightly fuller storage pit at a time, until reversing course was no longer a real option anyone seriously considered. There is no villain in this particular chapter of the human story, no single bad decision to point back at and blame. Just an enormous number of small, sensible choices made by an enormous number of people, each one perfectly reasonable in the moment, adding up to a destination none of them could have seen coming from where they stood. It is worth grieving this transition a little, even while acknowledging everything it eventually made possible. Something genuinely old, genuinely free, and genuinely irreplaceable came to a quiet, unremarkable end here, and almost nobody alive at the time had any way of knowing that it mattered enough to mourn. Every skill this documentary has spent 19 chapters describing: the tool-making, the endurance, the fire, the language, the care, the memory, all of it kept right on existing after this point. It simply stopped being organized around wandering and started being organized around a field that could not walk anywhere at all. Staying in one place changed the shape of a day more thoroughly than fire ever had. No more long walk in search of the next resource. No more following herds across enormous seasonal ranges. Instead, a fixed circle of land, watched over, returned to, tended, harvested, and eventually, in some places, deliberately planted. It would be easy, from where we stand now, to call this simple progress and move on. The bones of the people who actually lived through it tell a more complicated story. Bioarchaeological studies comparing forager skeletons against early farming populations consistently find shorter average stature, more dental disease, and more evidence of infectious illness in the settled, grain-dependent groups. A diet built mainly around one or two staple grains, however reliable, delivers far less nutritional variety than a life spent gathering dozens of different wild plants, roots, and animals across a whole season. Reliable and healthy, it turns out, are not automatically the same thing. Staying in one place also meant living, for the first time at real scale, in close and constant proximity to accumulated waste, stored grain that attracted pests, and eventually livestock, all of which gave infectious disease far more opportunity to take hold and spread than a small, constantly moving band ever provided. And the working day itself changed shape completely. A forager's day, for all its danger and hunger, followed its own loose internal logic. Walk, watch, gather, hunt, rest when the group judged it safe to rest. A farmer's day increasingly followed the calendar instead, planting on the field schedule, harvesting on the grain schedule, working whether the body wanted to that particular morning or not. None of this happened in a single dramatic afternoon. It crept forward across dozens of generations, one slightly larger storage pit at a time, one slightly longer stay in one place at a time, until the loose, wandering rhythm covered across almost this entire documentary had quietly become the exception rather than the rule. Somewhere in that slow drift on one unrecorded morning that looked exactly like the morning before it, the very last fully wandering, fully foraging day for that particular community simply happened and ended with absolutely no one aware that it was the last one of its kind they would ever live. That jolt of adrenaline when you cross an empty parking lot at night and hear footsteps behind you that are probably nothing. That is not a modern invention. That is the exact same circuit that once scanned a tree line at dawn for whatever might be watching from above. Psychologists studying fear have long noted that humans learn to fear snakes and spiders far faster and far more durably than we learn to fear objectively more dangerous modern things like electrical outlets or speeding cars. Researchers Arne Oman and Susan Manica called this prepared learning a kind of fear the brain arrives already primed for, inherited rather than personally taught. The Tong child skull, punctured by an eagle's talons 2.5 million years ago, is not really a separate story from your own flinch at a shadow crossing overhead. It is the same nervous system, tested by the same category of threat, running on a body that has changed far less than the world around it. The pierced shells of Blombos, worn to signal status 75,000 years ago, are not so different from a phone screen lighting up with likes or a closet full of clothes chosen as carefully as any ochre stripe once was. Being watched, judged, and ranked by your own community did not stop matching. It just changed its packaging completely. Social psychologists have found that people sorted into entirely meaningless, randomly assigned groups, no history, no shared belief, nothing at stake, will still quietly favor their own group and treat the other one with more suspicion, almost immediately. The border patrols at Guam and the invisible boundaries drawn by hominins long before that never fully retired. They just lost their spears. In that darker chapter, the one this film did not soften, about hunger pushing ordinary people toward the unthinkable, is not safely sealed inside the Ice Age either. In the winter of 1846, a group of American settlers known as the Donner Party became trapped by snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and some among them, starving, ultimately resorted to consuming the dead to survive. Ordinary travelers, families, people who, 3 months earlier, would have found the idea as unthinkable as anyone reading this does right now. The line separating the cut marks at Goff's Cave from a documented event less than 200 years ago is thinner and more recent than most of us would ever want to believe. Biologist Daniel Lieberman has spent years cataloging what he calls mismatched diseases, conditions that barely existed for most of human history because the environment never allowed the underlying vulnerability to fully express itself. A body built across nearly 2 million years of uncertain, hard-won calories, placed suddenly in front of unlimited cheap sugar and fat, does not know how to say no. It was never asked to. The fire that once bought a small group its first safe evening together has, over thousands of generations, turned into something that never really switches off. Streetlights, screens, and glowing rectangles held inches from the face push that invented evening deep into the night, long past when the body's oldest internal clock was ever designed to still be awake and alert. Psychiatrist Randolph Ness has argued that many modern anxiety disorders may not be malfunctions at all, but a threat detection system doing exactly its ancient job, scanning constantly for danger, in a world that has removed almost all the actual leopards while leaving the scanning instinct fully intact and, quite often, with nothing real left to find. That same wiring may explain something else entirely, a specific, modern loneliness that studies increasingly describe as a genuine health risk in its own right. For nearly the entire span covered by this documentary, a human simply did not exist apart from a small, tightly bonded group of familiar faces. Long stretches of true isolation would have been, for almost the whole of that time, close to a death sentence. A body and a brain built entirely around that expectation of near constant, low-level physical closeness to people who know you well does not simply update its settings because the surrounding architecture changed to apartments, commutes, and screens instead of shared fires and shared shelters. Biologist Edward Wilson proposed something he called the biophilia hypothesis, arguing humans carry an innate, largely unconscious pull toward natural environments, especially ones resembling open grassland dotted with scattered trees and a visible water source. Researchers Gordon Orions and Judith Hirwagen tested this directly and found people across wildly different cultures consistently rated exactly that kind of scene as the most calming and preferable, even among people who had spent their entire lives in cities. A preference for open grassland with scattered trees is not a coincidence or a matter of simple taste. It is a memory encoded below conscious thought of exactly the kind of terrain that once let a person see danger coming from a distance while still having somewhere close by to run. Even the microscopic world inside your own body carries an inheritance from that earlier life. Researchers studying the gut microbiome of the modern Hadza found dramatically greater microbial diversity than in populations eating a typical industrialized diet, a difference researchers connect directly to the sheer variety of wild foods a forager's daily search for food used to demand. A narrower, more processed modern diet did not just change what shows up on a plate. It changed the invisible ecosystem living inside nearly every person eating that diet. Another quiet, physical echo of a much older, much more varied relationship with food that most of us no longer have any direct memory of at all. Insomnia now affects a significant share of adults in industrialized countries, and sleep researchers increasingly point to exactly the mechanism covered earlier in this film. Artificial light extending the fire-lit evening far later than the body's oldest internal clock was ever built to expect, night after night, with no dawn cold enough to reliably wake anyone on cue anymore. Even a small child, tucked safely into a locked house in a quiet neighborhood, will often still insist on a light left on against the dark, afraid of a threat that almost certainly is not there. Ask that child what could possibly be hiding in the shadows, and you will rarely get a clear answer. The fear does not need one. It is older than reasons. Think back for a moment to every single piece of this film. The skull with 2 matching wounds. The apprenticeship behind a single hand axe. The frantic minutes around a fallen elephant. The elder fed by hands that were not his own. The fire that split the day in 2. The shell worn at the throat. The circle of stone built in absolute darkness. The children lost to a species that no longer exists. The famine that revealed both our worst and our best. The last free morning before the field took over. None of that was backstory. None of it was a prologue to the real story, which supposedly only started once writing, or cities, or your own lifetime finally arrived. That nearly 2 million year stretch was the main event, and you are, right now, simply its latest single day. Every single choice covered in this film, care or cruelty, hunger or generosity, silence or story, is still, right now, sitting somewhere inside the population of this planet, being made again quietly by someone in some kitchen or some office or some cold, unlit street, entirely unaware they are repeating a decision this old. That is, in the end, the entire argument of this documentary, stated as plainly as it can be. There was never a clean break between them and us. There was only ever one long, unbroken day, stretching back nearly 2 million years, and you happen to be standing in the part of it that has electricity. It is worth sitting with what this actually means for tomorrow morning, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived one. The same alertness that once scanned a tree lean will scan a crowded room instead. The same hunger for status will reach for something new to wear. The same old questions about who deserves care and who counts as a stranger will quietly resurface before lunch. So did any of it actually end? The waking dread, the tribal suspicion of outsiders, the craving to be noticed and ranked by your own group, the capacity, given the right unbearable pressure, to do something you would currently call monstrous. None of it looks gone. It looks relocated from open savanna to open plan office, from a cave mouth to a door frame, from a shaft full of bones to a headline you scrolled past this morning. Picture a city again, right now while after dark. Street lights standing in for the fire that once bought a group its first safe evening. Strangers passing close enough to touch, each one running a private, largely unconscious threat assessment on every other person they pass. The exact same background calculation that once scanned a savanna tree lean at dawn. Somewhere in that same city, someone is getting dressed for a night out, choosing exactly the right thing to be seen in, a direct descendant of a hole drilled through a shell 75,000 years ago. Somewhere else, someone is lying awake with a very old, very simple fear that the version of themselves everyone can see is not quite good enough, and that fear has never once needed a real predator to justify it. We like to imagine there is a clean, solid wall between that world and this one. Stone tools on one side, smartphones on the other. Nearly 2 million years of ordinary days say otherwise. The skull with 2 dents above the eyebrows, the shells worn at the throat, the 10,000 ivory beads laid over 2 children, the cut marks nobody wanted to find. All of it is still running quietly underneath whatever you plan on doing for the rest of today. The old day never actually ended. It just found a new place to happen, wearing your face, walking around inside your schedule, waiting the same way it always has to see what you do next.